Imagine a person sitting in a quiet office, watching their colleague present an idea during a meeting, and feeling an immediate wave of irritation and suspicion, convinced that the colleague is subtly mocking them or trying to undermine their standing with the group, when in reality the colleague is simply sharing thoughts with genuine enthusiasm and no ill intent whatsoever. This person might later complain to friends that everyone at work is envious and aggressive toward them, that they can sense the hostility in the room even when objective observers see only normal professional interaction and collaborative spirit. What has happened in this moment is that the individual has taken their own internal feelings, perhaps their own unacknowledged envy of the colleague's confidence, or their own aggressive impulses toward others, or their own desire to criticize and diminish, and instead of recognizing these feelings as originating from within themselves, they have unconsciously attributed these very same feelings and motivations to the people around them. This is projection, the psychological mechanism by which we place our own unwanted thoughts, emotions, and desires onto other people, essentially transferring the source of these uncomfortable internal experiences to an external target so that we no longer have to confront them as part of ourselves. The mind accomplishes this sleight of hand so smoothly and automatically that the person engaging in it rarely notices it happening, and instead experiences the world as genuinely hostile, filled with people who possess the very negative qualities that they themselves are struggling with. What makes this mechanism particularly persistent despite its obvious lack of logical foundation is that once we project our feelings onto others, we then interpret their behavior selectively, noticing only evidence that confirms our projected belief while dismissing or reinterpreting evidence that contradicts it, thereby. Consider the person who has decided to leave their job without securing another position first, a choice that defies conventional financial wisdom and stability, yet in the quiet moments before sleep, they construct an elaborate narrative in which this impulsive decision becomes a calculated act of self-preservation and personal growth, telling themselves that they were on the verge of burnout, that their mental health required immediate intervention, that the timing was somehow perfect despite all evidence suggesting otherwise, and that this leap into uncertainty represents courage rather than avoidance. Rationalization is the mind's sophisticated ability to generate plausible explanations for behaviors, decisions, or emotions that would otherwise create uncomfortable cognitive dissonance, a process by which we transform actions we know might be questionable into choices that seem reasonable, justified, and even noble when examined through the lens of our own internal logic. The mechanism operates beneath conscious awareness most of the time, automatically generating reasons and justifications that feel completely genuine and authentic to us, because they are derived from genuine aspects of our experience, yet they obscure the deeper, less acceptable motivations that actually drove our choices. What makes rationalization so psychologically persistent despite its fundamental unreliability is that it operates on partial truths, selecting certain facts while omitting others, emphasizing genuine concerns while minimizing inconvenient realities, creating a narrative architecture that feels coherent and defensible when we examine it closely. We have normalized this process so thoroughly in modern society that we rarely recognize it occurring, instead accepting our own explanations for our behavior with remarkable ease, trusting our post hoc justifications as if they represent our actual reasons for acting, when in truth they serve primarily to protect. Consider the person who receives troubling news from their doctor, a diagnosis that carries real implications for their health and future, yet finds themselves thinking about it as something that happened to someone else, or something that cannot possibly apply to their own body, despite the medical evidence sitting right in front of them on the clipboard. Denial operates as a psychological mechanism where the mind simply refuses to acknowledge a reality that contradicts what we need or want to believe, and rather than processing the information as true, we unconsciously distance ourselves from it, minimize it, or reject it outright, even when acceptance would actually serve us better. The mechanism functions by creating a protective barrier between consciousness and unbearable truths, allowing the ego to maintain its sense of safety and control when faced with information that threatens our identity, security, or worldview. It is not a deliberate choice or a conscious act of dishonesty, but rather an automatic response where the mind essentially says this cannot be real, this is not happening to me, this is not my responsibility, and as long as we do not speak it into existence or acknowledge it fully, we can continue moving through our days without confronting the weight of what we know to be true. What is remarkable about denial is that it persists not because we lack the intelligence to see reality clearly, but because the emotional cost of acceptance feels too high and the mind prioritizes immediate comfort over eventual understanding. We have normalized this mechanism throughout human societies by recognizing it in everyone around us without judgment, perhaps because we all employ it when facing our own difficult truths, and so we maintain an unspoken agreement not to push too hard when someone is clearly unable to face something, understanding implicitly that sometimes the human psyche needs time and gentleness to integrate painful realities. Imagine yourself in a moment of overwhelming stress, perhaps during a difficult conversation where painful truths are being revealed, or in the midst of a situation that feels genuinely threatening to your sense of safety or identity. You notice that while your body remains present in the room, your mind has somehow drifted away, creating a subtle but distinct separation between your conscious awareness and your immediate surroundings. You might observe yourself from a slight distance, as though watching a film of your own life rather than living it directly, or the world around you might suddenly feel dreamlike and unreal, with colors muted and sounds becoming distant echoes. This psychological mechanism, known as dissociation, represents a protective response in which your mind essentially disconnects from experiences that feel too intense, too painful, or too dangerous to process fully in the moment. When your nervous system detects a threat that seems insurmountable through normal coping mechanisms, it activates this escape route, fragmenting your awareness and creating a psychological distance that makes unbearable experiences feel somehow more manageable. Dissociative response operates on a spectrum ranging from mild daydreaming to complete detachment from reality, and it functions by dampening the intensity of emotional and physical sensations, allowing your consciousness to retreat into a kind of protective numbness. This mechanism becomes particularly entrenched because it genuinely does provide immediate relief, yet paradoxically, repeated use of dissociation can prevent genuine emotional processing and integration of difficult experiences. Over time, what begins as an emergency response can become a habitual pattern, activated even in situations that no longer pose genuine threat, until we find ourselves walking through life with a persistent sense of unreality or disconnection that we have come to accept as simply how we are. Imagine a person who has experienced profound disappointment in their personal relationships, a series of rejections that have left them feeling inadequate and emotionally wounded, and rather than dwelling in that pain or seeking destructive outlets, they channel all of that hurt and restless energy into their work, their art, their fitness routine, or their pursuit of academic excellence. Finding themselves suddenly driven with an almost supernatural intensity to achieve things they had previously only dreamed about, and over time, these accomplishments begin to feel genuine and fulfilling in their own right, even as the original wound remains quietly present beneath the surface. Sublimation works by taking emotions that feel unbearable or unacceptable, rage, jealousy, shame, sexual frustration, or grief, and transforming them into socially valued activities and creative pursuits, essentially alchemizing psychological pain into productivity and achievement through a process that feels almost natural and automatic rather than deliberate or strategic. The mechanism operates because our psyche cannot simply destroy difficult emotions without consequence, so it redirects them toward outlets that our conscious mind and our society both approve of, making what might otherwise become destructive or self-sabotaging impulses into something we celebrate and admire. And this redirection happens largely outside our conscious awareness, meaning the person experiencing it rarely feels they are hiding from anything. What persists despite its psychological origins is the genuine satisfaction and meaning these pursuits create. For sublimation does not require that the achievement be false or hollow, only that its emotional fuel comes from sources we have not fully acknowledged, and we have normalized this so thoroughly in modern culture that we rarely question whether our ambitions, our creative output, and our relentless pursuit of success are entirely our own author. Consider the moment when an adult, facing overwhelming stress or uncertainty, finds themselves curling up beneath blankets in a darkened room, speaking in a softer voice, seeking comfort from a parent or caregiver, or suddenly craving foods from childhood with an intensity that feels almost primal. This is regression, a psychological defense mechanism wherein an individual retreats to an earlier stage of psychological development when confronted with anxiety, threat, or emotional pain that feels too large to process at their current level of maturity. When the adult world becomes too demanding, too complex, or too frightening, the mind instinctively moves backward to a time when responsibilities were fewer, when protection was more assured, and when the simple act of being cared for was enough to dissolve distress. The mechanism operates quietly and often without conscious awareness, as the individual might not recognize that they are adopting childlike behaviors or perspectives until someone else points it out, or until the moment passes and clarity returns. Psychologically, regression serves a protective function by reducing the perceived scope of the problem to something that the younger self would know how to navigate, thus lowering the psychological demand to tolerable levels and allowing the nervous system to downshift from acute alarm. This explains why we see regression during illness, after receiving traumatic news, during severe relationship conflict, or in situations where control has been entirely stripped away. What remains curious is how normalized this pattern has become in adult life, how acceptable it is to temporarily abandon the competence and autonomy we have cultivated, and how we have constructed an entire culture around regressive comfort seeking through nostalgia, comfort objects, and the deliberate consumption of entertainment and food from our younger years, treating these mechanisms not as defense strategies, but as simple plea. Imagine a difficult conversation with your supervisor at work, one where you felt criticized or dismissed, and the encounter leaves you feeling small and powerless in that moment. You cannot respond with the anger or defensiveness that rises within you because the power dynamic is too unequal, the consequences too uncertain, and the professional setting too constraining. So you leave the office and arrive home, and when your partner asks a simple question about dinner or mentions a minor inconvenience, you find yourself responding with disproportionate frustration, your voice sharp and your words cutting in ways that surprise even you. The emotional intensity you felt in that boardroom has been redirected entirely toward someone who had nothing to do with the original wound. This is displacement, the psychological mechanism through which we take an emotion generated by one person or situation and express it toward another target that feels safer, more available, or less threatening to confront directly. The original source of our anger or anxiety remains unaddressed, while an innocent party absorbs the overflow of feelings they did not create. The mechanism operates through a simple emotional logic. When we cannot safely direct our feelings toward their true source, we unconsciously seek an alternative outlet, someone or something that presents fewer risks to our safety, our employment, our relationships, or our sense of control. A child who is punished harshly by a parent may later kick the family dog, transferring their humiliation and rage onto a creature even more powerless than themselves. An employee who cannot express frustration with an unfair policy may go home and argue vehemently with their spouse about household tasks that would normally warrant only mild discussion. Consider the person who experienced a deeply troubling event during childhood, perhaps a moment of profound embarrassment or a frightening experience involving a trusted adult, and yet when asked about their early years, they find themselves unable to recall these incidents with any clarity or emotional weight, as though those memories have simply dissolved into the fog of time, leaving only a vague sense that something once mattered, but feeling curiously distant from its original significance. Repression operates as a protective mechanism wherein the mind actively, though entirely unconsciously, pushes distressing thoughts, emotions, memories, or impulses away from conscious awareness, not through a deliberate act of will or reasoning, but through a kind of psychological redirection that prevents overwhelming material from surfacing into the waking mind where it might cause acute distress or dysfunction. The mechanism works by essentially creating a barrier between the conscious and unconscious mind, allowing the individual to function in daily life without being plagued by anxiety, grief, guilt, or shame that would otherwise demand constant attention and emotional energy, thereby preserving psychological equilibrium and enabling the person to continue meeting responsibilities and engaging with others despite carrying unprocessed emotional material beneath the surface. What remains remarkable about repression is how thoroughly the mind accomplishes this feat without any conscious instruction, without any logical decision-making process that we can trace or audit, as though there exists within human consciousness a kind of automatic valve that closes off certain memories or feelings the moment they threaten to overwhelm our psychological capacity to bear them. Consider the person who experienced deep rejection in childhood, who learned that vulnerability meant pain, and who now presents themselves to the world as aggressively confident, dismissing all forms of emotional expression as weakness or sentimentality. Consider the individual who harbors unspoken fears about their own competence, yet becomes the harshest critic of others' mistakes, attacking their colleagues with a fervor that seems disproportionate to the actual offense. Consider someone who feels profoundly inadequate and in response adopts an air of superiority, surrounding themselves with symbols of status and achievement that serve as external validators for an internal void. These are expressions of reaction formation, a psychological defense mechanism wherein a person unconsciously adopts behaviors, attitudes, or beliefs that are directly opposite to their true underlying feelings or impulses. The mind, faced with an unacceptable emotion or desire that threatens the individual's self-image or safety, mobilizes a counter-response so forceful and theatrical that it overwhelms the original feeling beneath it. The anxiety remains present, but it becomes disguised, channeled into its opposite, transformed into a performance that the person eventually comes to believe is genuine. What makes this mechanism particularly subtle is that it operates with considerable conviction. The defended person is not consciously lying, but rather has constructed an alternate emotional reality that feels authentic to them. The intensity of the counter-attitude often serves as a clue to the buried impulse beneath it, for excessive displays of certainty or strength frequently mask the very doubts and vulnerabilities being defended against. Yet despite our capacity to recognize these patterns intellectually, we continue to accept them without question in ourselves and others, normalizing the paradox of people loudly proclaiming the opposite of what they truly. When confronted with overwhelming emotional pain or distressing situations that threaten our sense of stability, the human mind often retreats into the refuge of abstract thought and rational analysis, transforming raw feelings into detached intellectual discourse that feels safer and more manageable than the raw emotion itself. Imagine someone who has just experienced a profound loss, a relationship ending, or a deeply personal betrayal, yet instead of allowing themselves to feel the weight of that grief or hurt, they begin constructing elaborate theoretical frameworks about attachment theory, evolutionary psychology, or philosophical arguments about the impermanence of all things. The painful reality of their experience becomes transmuted into compelling intellectual arguments and fascinating conceptual puzzles to solve. And in this transformation, the sharp edges of genuine emotion are dulled and distanced. This is intellectualization, and it operates through a remarkable psychological mechanism wherein the mind recognizes that emotions are threatening and uncontrollable. So it channels the energy of those emotions into the realm of ideas, analysis, and abstraction, where the mind feels it maintains greater authority and dominion. What makes intellectualization so persistent despite its limitations is that it genuinely works in the short term, providing immediate relief and a sense of mastery and control that raw emotion does not offer. The intellectual framework feels productive, sophisticated, and purposeful in ways that crying or feeling does not, and our culture has largely normalized and even rewarded this tendency by celebrating analytical thinking over emotional processing. Yet beneath the carefully constructed towers of reasoning lies the unprocessed emotional experience, waiting patiently in the depths of the psyche, remaining as real and demanding as ever. Consider a moment when you find yourself thinking about someone you care deeply about, and suddenly, without warning, a single disagreement or disappointment causes your entire perception of them to shift into something entirely opposite, as though you are seeing them through completely different eyes, where all the positive qualities you once cherished seem to vanish entirely and are replaced by an equally intense focus on their flaws and failures, leaving you convinced that this negative version is the true one and always has been. This psychological phenomenon, known as splitting, represents a defense mechanism wherein the mind divides people, experiences, or aspects of reality into absolute categories of all good or all bad, with little room for the nuanced complexity that exists in between. And when the mind employs this mechanism, it essentially protects itself from the unbearable tension that comes with accepting that someone or something can be simultaneously beneficial and harmful, trustworthy and unreliable. Loving and disappointing. The mechanism emerges often during periods of emotional stress or when we encounter a challenge to our sense of safety or security, and our mind, seeking immediate relief from cognitive dissonance, collapses the spectrum of human behavior into binary categories that feel more manageable and psychologically digestible. The brain accomplishes this by selectively filtering memories and information, amplifying evidence that supports the current polarized view while suppressing or reinterpreting contradictory evidence, until the narrative feels complete and justified, and this selective processing happens beneath conscious awareness, making it feel like objective truth rather than psychological protection. Yet despite our capacity for rational thought, and despite the countless times we might recognize that people are inherently complex beings who contain multitudes, we find ourselves repeatedly falling into this sply. Consider the person who works in a demanding corporate environment where they must maintain a professional demeanor, suppress their authentic emotions, and adhere to rigid hierarchical structures throughout the entire workday, only to return home and shift seamlessly into the role of a nurturing parent or affectionate partner, completely bracketing away the stress and frustration they experienced mere hours before. This mental separation between different aspects of life represents the psychological mechanism known as compartmentalization, wherein the mind essentially creates distinct psychological spaces or containers where different emotions, experiences, beliefs, or aspects of the self are kept separate from one another, preventing them from interfering with or contaminating each other. The human mind accomplishes this feat through a deliberate and often automatic process of isolating thoughts and feelings associated with one role or situation, so that they do not permeate into other domains of life, allowing a person to function effectively across multiple contexts that might otherwise create internal conflict or cognitive dissonance. When this process works optimally, it serves a genuinely adaptive function, enabling us to shift our focus and emotional tone as circumstances demand, maintaining compartmentalized identities that allow us to be one version of ourselves at work, another with family, and yet another among friends. However, what makes compartmentalization particularly fascinating from a psychological perspective is that we rarely acknowledge how extraordinary it is to maintain these rigid separations, how much mental energy it requires to keep these compartments sealed off from one another, and how normalized this fragmentation has become in modern life. Imagine a morning when you wake up and remember something deeply uncomfortable that happened weeks ago, something that stirred anger or shame or fear within you, and instead of sitting with that feeling, you simply decide not to think about it anymore, pushing it away with the gentle but firm resolve of someone closing a door and turning the lock, and you move through your day successfully avoiding any thought or acknowledgement of what occurred, speaking to friends about other matters. Focusing your attention on work or entertainment or any number of distraction available to you, and this mechanism we call suppression operates as a conscious, deliberate choice to exclude unwanted thoughts, feelings, or impulses from awareness, functioning differently from repression in that you are actively choosing the avoidance rather than it happening automatically in your unconscious mind. The psychological logic underlying suppression suggests that by consciously removing distressing material from immediate thought, we reduce the emotional pain or discomfort associated with it, creating a temporary sense of peace and control, allowing us to function without being overwhelmed by what troubles us. And this makes intuitive sense, because our minds do appear to have limited capacity for processing difficult emotions simultaneously. Yet what becomes curious is how we have normalized and even valorized this mechanism in contemporary life, treating the ability to suppress uncomfortable thoughts as a mark of strength or productivity, encouraging ourselves and others to simply move forward and not dwell on negativity, to let things go and focus on the bright side, creating entire industries around distraction and escapism that exist partly to facilitate this suppression on a mass scale. Consider the adolescent who has experienced emotional neglect from a parent, yet finds themselves unconsciously adopting that same parent's mannerisms, speech patterns, and values as they move into adulthood, even while consciously resenting the parent for their absence. This is identification at work, a mechanism through which we internalize the characteristics, attitudes, and behaviors of those around us, particularly figures we perceive as powerful, threatening, or significant in some way. When faced with anxiety, conflict, or feelings of powerlessness in relation to another person, the mind employs identification as a means of managing that discomfort by essentially becoming like the other person, thereby reducing the threat they represent and simultaneously gaining a sense of control and belonging. The younger employee who admires their intimidating boss and slowly begins to mirror their leadership style, their decisiveness, and even their emotional distance from colleagues, is engaging in this same protective process, absorbing the qualities of someone who seems to possess authority and competence in ways they fear they do not. The mechanism operates on a profound psychological logic. If we become like those we fear or feel inferior to, we no longer need to fear them, and we gain access to the strength and security we perceive them to possess. What persists as remarkable is how deeply this process operates below conscious awareness, how we often fail to recognize the ways our personalities have been shaped by identification with figures from our past, and how we may spend years unconsciously recreating patterns from people we actively sought to be different from. We normalize this as simply growing up, as natural development, as inevitable influence, yet rarely do we pause to examine which aspects of ourselves were chosen and which were absorbed through this protective mechanism that transforms anxiety into assimilation. Consider the moment when a child receives criticism from a parent, and rather than questioning whether that criticism is fair or accurate, the child simply accepts it entirely and makes it part of their internal belief system, carrying those words forward into adulthood as though they were absolute truth rather than one person's opinion delivered in a specific moment of frustration or concern. Introjection occurs when we unconsciously absorb the values, beliefs, attitudes, and criticisms of others into our own psyche without any filtering process, without any examination of whether these introjects actually align with our genuine thoughts or serve our well-being in any meaningful way. We take in the voices of authority figures, particularly those from our earliest years, and we allow them to become our own internal voice, so seamlessly woven into our sense of self that we forget entirely that these thoughts originated elsewhere and were never truly ours to begin with. The psychological mechanism at work here involves the blurring of boundaries between self and other, where the mind, in its attempt to maintain connection and safety within important relationships, chooses incorporation over independence, choosing to become the person we believe we need to be in order to remain loved and accepted. Over time, we accumulate layers of these introjects from teachers and peers and cultural messages and media, until our inner world becomes a crowded parliament of borrowed voices, each one competing for influence over our decisions and self-perception. What persists despite having no logical foundation is our tendency to treat these introjects as though they represent our authentic preferences and values, defending them fiercely even when they cause us suffering, even when they contradict other parts of ourselves, even when they no longer serve anyone at all. Imagine you've said something harsh to a friend during a moment of frustration, words that landed poorly and created tension between you, and now hours later you find yourself replaying that conversation endlessly in your mind, constructing elaborate scenarios where you reach out with elaborate gifts, exaggerated apologies, or a series of performative gestures designed to somehow erase what was said, as though the hurtful words never existed at all. This is undoing, a psychological defense mechanism where the mind attempts to neutralize anxiety, guilt, or shame by engaging in actions, thoughts, or behaviors that feel like they might reverse or counteract a previous thought or deed, as if the universe operates on a magical principle where enough positive action can retroactively cancel out negative action. The mechanism emerges from a deeply human desire to escape the consequences of our own behavior, to find some way to undo time itself, to restore a version of reality where we never made that mistake, never hurt that person, never disappointed ourselves or others. We engage in this process because guilt is genuinely uncomfortable, because the weight of our actions sits heavily on our consciousness, and our minds desperately seek relief from this burden through whatever means seems psychologically available. What makes undoing particularly persistent despite its fundamental illogic is that it occasionally seems to work. When you apologize profusely and your friend eventually forgives you, it feels as though your undoing actions actually did erase the harm, when in reality the forgiveness was simply a separate social event that occurred afterward. We've normalized this defense mechanism so thoroughly that we barely recognize it operating, seeing our excessive apologies and compensatory behaviors as simply being thoughtful or conscientious, rather than recognizing them as anxious attempts to magically reverse time and rewrite history through the sheer force. Consider the person who has experienced a profound disappointment or social rejection and who subsequently withdraws from all meaningful contact with others, choosing instead to spend their days alone in quiet spaces where they need not confront the reality of their circumstances or face the possibility of further hurt. They might decline invitations from friends, avoid family gatherings, and construct elaborate explanations for why they cannot attend events, all while telling themselves that solitude is preferable to the risk of additional pain. This withdrawal serves a protective function in the moment, creating a sealed environment where external judgments cannot penetrate and where the person maintains complete control over what emotional stimuli they must process. The mechanism operates on a simple principle. If one removes oneself from situations that might trigger shame, embarrassment, or further rejection, then one need not experience those sensations at all. The mind reasons that isolation equals safety, that distance equals protection, and that invisibility equals invulnerability. Yet what begins as a rational response to immediate danger often persists long after the threat has diminished or disappeared entirely. The person who once needed solitude to recover finds themselves months or years later still unable to re-enter social spaces, still convinced at some deep level that others would reject them if given the chance, still believing that their absence from the world somehow protects both themselves and those around them from disappointment. We normalize this pattern by calling it introversion or preference, by accepting the individual's explanation that they simply enjoy being alone, when perhaps what we are witnessing is a defense mechanism that has calcified into an identity. Consider the moment when someone you trust says something deeply hurtful, and your immediate response is to think that it was not really that bad, that you are probably overreacting, that they did not mean it the way it sounded, that you have certainly heard worse before. This is minimization, a psychological defense mechanism where the mind deliberately reduces the significance, severity, or impact of an experience, emotion, or event in order to protect itself from overwhelming distress or cognitive dissonance. When faced with something threatening to our sense of safety or self-worth, minimization allows us to shrink the problem down to a more manageable size, to convince ourselves that the wound is smaller than it actually is, that the betrayal is less profound, that the loss is not as consequential as the initial shock suggested. The mechanism operates through a kind of mental arithmetic where we subtract weight from reality, where we tell ourselves stories about how much worse things could be, how resilient we actually are, how we have survived difficulty before, and therefore this particular difficulty must be survivable, and therefore must not be as severe as we feared. We minimize the pain of rejection by reminding ourselves that we did not really want that relationship anyway. We minimize the shock of failure by insisting that the goal was never that important to us. We minimize the sting of criticism by assuming the critic did not really understand what we were trying to do. The psychological machinery behind this mechanism is straightforward. By reducing the emotional weight of an event, we reduce the emotional response required, and therefore we feel less overwhelmed, less destabilized, less in need of major internal reorganization. Yet despite how logical this strategy appears in the moment, it often perpetuates suffering rather than resolving it, because the denied or minimized experience does not actually disappear, but instead accumula. When we first encounter someone new in our lives, particularly someone who captures our attention romantically or fills a role we deeply need filled, we often experience a phenomenon where we mentally elevate them to a status far beyond what reality would support, constructing an elaborate image of their perfection that bears little resemblance to the actual human being before us. We focus intensely on their most appealing qualities while simultaneously filtering out or minimizing their flaws, their contradictions, and their very ordinary human limitations, creating instead a figure who seems almost impossibly ideal, almost impossibly right for us in every conceivable way. We see only what we wish to see, we hear only what we wish to hear, and we interpret their ambiguous actions in the most generous possible light, transforming neutral gestures into profound declarations of failing and commitment. This psychological defense mechanism serves a protective function in the early stages of attachment, allowing us to feel hope and connection and the possibility of being truly understood, yet it simultaneously blinds us to genuine incompatibility and warning signs that might otherwise prompt more careful evaluation. The mechanism persists within us even as we grow older and accumulate experience precisely because it provides such profound emotional comfort, such a powerful antidote to loneliness and existential uncertainty, that we find ourselves repeatedly vulnerable to its effects regardless of how many times we have watched idealization crumble into disillusionment. We become invested in maintaining these idealized images because to acknowledge their falseness feels like losing something precious, like admitting that we were foolish or desperate, and so we cling to our constructed versions of people even as reality insists, again and again, on revealing their authentic selves. Consider the experience of someone who has recently ended a romantic relationship, and in the weeks that follow, they begin to rewrite their memory of their former partner, suddenly recalling only their flaws, their irritating habits, their fundamental inadequacies, while the moments of genuine connection and tenderness seem to fade into insignificance or disappear entirely from conscious recollection. The person who once felt like a soulmate becomes, in retrospect, someone fundamentally unworthy of the time that was invested, someone who was never really as special or as valuable as they once appeared to be. This psychological mechanism is devaluation, and it operates as a protective shield against the pain of loss and rejection by systematically diminishing the worth of what has been lost, thereby reducing the emotional impact of its absence. When we devalue something or someone, we are essentially telling ourselves a story in which that thing or person was never as good as we believed it to be, and therefore its loss is less significant than it initially felt. The mind performs this quiet alchemy by filtering memories through a lens of criticism, by magnifying minor disappointments into character flaws, and by recontextualizing kindness as manipulation or insincerity. This defense mechanism serves a genuine psychological function, allowing us to move forward without being crushed by grief or shame, protecting our self-esteem from the implications that we were foolish to value something so deeply. Yet devaluation persists even when we intellectually recognize that it is occurring, even when we know that the person or object was genuinely valuable, because the emotional relief it provides is immediate and powerful, and the mind prioritizes this relief over the maintenance of an accurate or balanced perspective. Imagine a child sitting in a classroom, struggling to process the shame of being corrected harshly by a teacher in front of their peers, and instead of acknowledging the embarrassment or expressing it through words, they suddenly stand up, knock their pencil across the desk, make a face at the teacher, or engage in some form of disruptive physical behavior that gets them sent out of the room. What has happened in that moment is not simple misbehavior, but rather a complex psychological process called acting out, wherein the person converts internal emotional pain, anxiety, or conflict into external behavioral expression without consciously recognizing the connection between their inner turmoil and their outward actions. The defense mechanism functions by allowing individuals to bypass the cognitive processing of difficult emotions entirely, sidestepping the psychological pain through physical manifestation instead. Rather than sitting with the discomfort of shame or rejection, the mind finds relief through action, through the body's response, through making something visible and external that would otherwise remain invisible and internal. The emotional conflict gets transferred from the realm of thought and feeling into the realm of behavior, where it can be expressed without requiring the person to directly confront or articulate what they are actually experiencing. This mechanism becomes particularly prevalent in situations where verbal expression feels unsafe, where there is no permission for emotional vulnerability, or where the person lacks the developmental capacity or language skills to describe their internal experience. The physical act becomes a substitute for psychological understanding, a way of communicating distress through action rather than words, and remarkably, the person often remains unaware of why they are behaving this way, experiencing it instead as an impulse they could not control. Consider the employee who disagrees with their manager's decision but says nothing in the meeting, then deliberately misses the deadline, arrives late to the implementation, or performs the task with just enough mediocrity to demonstrate dissatisfaction without ever voicing a direct complaint. Or imagine the family member who claims to support a relative's new relationship while consistently forgetting important events, offering subtle criticisms disguised as concern or helping in ways that create more problems than solutions. Passive aggression emerges when we harbor anger, resentment, or disagreement, but lack either the safety, courage, or emotional vocabulary to express these feelings directly. So instead, we channel them through indirect behaviors that communicate our displeasure while maintaining plausible deniability. The mechanism works by allowing us to act on our hostile impulses without accepting responsibility for hostility, creating distance between our aggressive actions and our self-image as reasonable people, because we can always claim we were simply forgetful, tired, or trying our best. We send the message through our inaction, our lateness, our incompetence, or our reluctant compliance, letting our behavior do the talking we cannot permit our voices to do. What makes this defense mechanism so persistent despite its obvious dysfunctionality is that it often works in the short term, creating enough friction or consequences that others eventually give up their requests or change their behavior around us, which reinforces the pattern. We have also normalized it extensively in culture, often framing it as humor or personality quirk rather than unresolved conflict, laughing at stories of subtle sabotage and calling it being clever or having boundaries, when it is actually just avoiding the difficult vulnerability of honest communication while still punishing those around us. Consider the person who experiences persistent headaches, muscle tension, or digestive discomfort whenever they face a difficult conversation or a period of intense emotional strain, yet medical examinations reveal no physical pathology that could explain these symptoms. This is somatization, the psychological defense mechanism by which emotional pain and psychological distress are unconsciously converted into physical bodily sensations and complaints. The mind, unable or unwilling to consciously process anxiety, grief, shame, or unresolved trauma, channels these feelings instead into the body, where they manifest as real, tangible pain that feels undeniably genuine to the person experiencing it. The mechanism operates through the intricate connection between the nervous system and emotional processing centers in the brain, where suppressed feelings trigger physiological responses such as muscle tightening, inflammation, or altered pain perception that the conscious mind interprets as legitimate physical illness. This process is not deliberate or conscious. The person is not fabricating or exaggerating their symptoms, but rather their psychological distress has genuinely reorganized into somatic experience. What makes somatization particularly persistent is that the physical symptoms themselves become the primary focus of attention and treatment, further reinforcing the pattern and obscuring the emotional root cause beneath layers of medical investigation, medication, and bodily concern. The person may spend years visiting physicians and specialists, undergoing tests and treatments, all while the underlying emotional conflict remains unaddressed and continues to generate new physical manifestations. Society has normalized this process by validating physical symptoms while remaining largely skeptical of purely psychological suffering, creating a system in which it is often easier to admit to back pain than to acknowledge depression or unprocessed low. Consider the person who experiences profound emotional distress, perhaps grief so overwhelming that the mind itself seems unable to process the weight of loss, and instead of tears or visible suffering, their body begins to speak in a language all its own. A pain emerges in the chest that no cardiologist can explain, a paralysis creeps through the limbs despite all neurological tests returning normal, a blindness descends without damage to the eyes themselves, or a voice simply vanishes from the throat though the vocal cords remain intact. This is conversion, a remarkable and perplexing mechanism wherein psychological conflict, emotional turmoil, or unbearable mental anguish becomes transformed and expressed through physical symptoms that have no organic medical basis. The unconscious mind, faced with an emotional crisis so profound that conscious processing seems impossible, redirects that psychological pain into the body itself, where it can be managed, explained, and in some paradoxical way, even controlled. The mechanism operates on a principle of displacement and transformation, taking what cannot be felt in the mind and converting it into what can be felt in the flesh, something tangible and observable rather than abstract and overwhelming. Historically, this phenomenon was once so common that entire medical specialties formed around its treatment, with physicians observing patients whose suffering was entirely real despite having no physical cause. What makes conversion particularly fascinating is how it persists even in our modern era of advanced diagnostics and psychological understanding, even when we intellectually comprehend that our symptoms lack medical foundation. People continue to experience genuine physical manifestations of psychological conflict, their bodies stubbornly expressing what their minds cannot articulate, a silent translation of inner chaos into outer illness, a profound testimony to the inseparable connection between W. When the pressures of reality become too overwhelming, when the circumstances of your life feel constrained by limitation and disappointment, the mind often retreats into an elaborate construction of alternative scenarios, imagined futures, and invented worlds where different outcomes are possible. This is fantasy as a psychological defense mechanism, a mental escape that allows us to temporarily suspend our engagement with what is actually happening around us. Consider the person working an unfulfilling job, sitting at a desk that feels like a cage, watching the hours pass with a sense of emptiness and purposelessness. Rather than fully confronting the difficult emotions that arise from this situation, their mind drifts into detailed imaginings of a different life, perhaps one where they have achieved great success, or found meaningful work, or traveled to distant places. In those moments of mental absence, the brain is not processing the actual distress of the present moment, but rather constructing a pleasurable alternative narrative that provides temporary relief. The mechanism works because fantasy activates reward pathways in the brain without requiring any real-world change or action. The person can feel the satisfaction of imagined accomplishment, the joy of imagined connection, the peace of imagined escape, all while their body remains stationary and their actual circumstances remain unchanged. Over time, this defense can become so habitual that people spend more of their mental life in invented scenarios than in genuine engagement with reality. We have normalized this extensively through entertainment, through constant access to stories and alternate realities, through devices that allow us to disappear into other worlds at any moment. Yet despite how common and even encouraged this practice has become, it remains fundamentally a way of avoiding rather than addressing what troubles us, a temporary solution that leaves the underlying difficulty. Consider the person who has just received devastating news, perhaps a diagnosis or a loss, and in the moments that follow, they find themselves making jokes, their voice taking on a lighter quality even as their eyes remain hollow with the weight of what they have just learned. Consider, too, the workplace where tension runs dangerously high, where conflict threatens to unravel the delicate social fabric, and suddenly someone makes an observation that is absurd or unexpected, and the entire room releases tension through laughter, the argument momentarily suspended in a bubble of shared amusement. Humor in these contexts operates as a psychological defense mechanism that allows us to create distance between ourselves and experiences that feel overwhelming, threatening, or psychologically unbearable. When we joke about something painful, we transform our relationship to it, shifting from victim to narrator, from sufferer to observer with enough perspective to find incongruity or absurdity in the situation. The mechanism works because humor requires a certain cognitive distance. It demands that we step outside of the raw emotion and examine something from an angle that reveals its contradictions or unexpected juxtapositions. This distance, even momentary, provides genuine psychological relief, a brief respite from the full weight of difficult feelings that might otherwise consume us entirely. What is remarkable about humor as a defense is that despite being fundamentally a cognitive reframing tool with no direct impact on external circumstances, it persists as one of the most socially accepted and even celebrated coping mechanisms we possess. We have normalized the use of jokes in grief, in stress, in situations of profound uncertainty, understanding intuitively that the person who can laugh has found a way to remain somewhat intact, somewhat autonomous in the face of forces that might otherwise feel entirely controlling and destructive. Consider the person who finds themselves overwhelmed by anxiety about their own future, their finances uncertain, their health fragile, their relationships strained, and yet somehow discovers themselves spending hours volunteering at a local shelter, preparing meals for strangers, listening intently to the problems of others, donating money they can scarcely afford to spare to causes that feel urgent and meaningful. They might organize community events, mentor struggling young people, or dedicate their limited free time to helping neighbors with repairs or errands, all while their own life feels as though it is quietly unraveling in ways they cannot fully address. The remarkable thing about this person is not that they are helping others, but rather the intensity and priority with which they pursue this helping despite their own pressing needs remaining unmet. When asked about this pattern, they often struggle to articulate why it matters so much, only that it does, that it feels necessary, that there is something deeply satisfying about focusing on the genuine welfare of another person at the expense of their own concerns. What operates beneath this behavior is a psychological mechanism of remarkable elegance and subtlety. By channeling emotional energy into the needs and problems of others, the individual effectively displaces their own internal conflicts and anxieties onto an external stage where they can be managed, contained, and potentially solved through deliberate action. Their own problems feel nebulous, intractable, beyond their control, whereas the problems of others often present themselves as concrete and solvable through direct intervention. In this way, altruism functions not merely as a virtue, but as a sophisticated redirection of psychological discomfort, a way of proving one's worth and competence in domains where success is measurable and visible. The act of helping becomes a proof of one's value when internal worth feels uncertain. Anticipation operates as a psychological defense mechanism when we find ourselves mentally preparing for future events, outcomes, or conversations that have not yet occurred, channeling our anxiety into a productive framework of imagined scenarios and rehearsed responses that allow us to feel a sense of control over uncertainty. Consider the person who spends hours before a difficult meeting mentally rehearsing what might be said, how they might respond, what objections they might encounter, and how they will handle each potential reaction, constructing an elaborate internal narrative that transforms the formless dread of the unknown into something tangible and manageable. The mechanism operates by shifting our focus from the discomfort of not knowing toward the activity of preparation, creating an illusion of agency when agency is actually quite limited, since most future scenarios we construct will never actually unfold as imagined. What makes anticipation function as a defense is its capacity to channel generalized anxiety into specific mental rehearsal, giving the mind something to do rather than something to endure, transforming passive worry into what feels like active problem solving. Yet the curious aspect of anticipation is that despite our logical understanding that most imagined futures never materialize as we envision them, we continue to engage in this mental preparation with remarkable consistency and investment, spending countless hours constructing scenarios that exist nowhere but in our minds. We have normalized anticipation so thoroughly that we consider it evidence of responsibility and conscientiousness, praising those who are well prepared and mentally rehearsed, rarely acknowledging that this preparation often exceeds what is functionally necessary or useful. Consider a person who experiences a significant failure in one area of their life. Perhaps they were passed over for a promotion at work or they did not achieve the academic results they hoped for, and in response to this disappointment, they begin to invest tremendous energy and attention into a different domain entirely, pouring their efforts into mastering a hobby, excelling at sports, or becoming deeply involved in volunteer work with an intensity that seems almost desperate in its fervor. This is compensation, a psychological mechanism through which we unconsciously attempt to balance out perceived deficiencies or losses by overachieving in alternative areas, creating a sense of overall competence and worth that counteracts the blow to our self-esteem. The mechanism operates on a surprisingly logical foundation. If we cannot succeed in one meaningful arena of our lives, we reason, at least we can demonstrate our capabilities and value in another, and through this demonstration, we can restore our sense of self-respect and convince both ourselves and those around us that we are still capable, still worthy, still adequate as human beings. The brain recognizes a threat to identity and reputation and automatically redirects motivational energy toward a more promising target, a kind of psychological hedging strategy that allows us to maintain our narrative of competence even when reality has challenged it in one particular domain. Yet despite the rational kernel at its core, we rarely acknowledge this mechanism openly, and we often dress up our compensatory behaviors in language of genuine passion or authentic interest, when in truth we may be performing emotional labor for an invisible audience, trying to balance an equation that nobody else even knows is unbalanced. Consider the person who knows their relationship has become unhealthy, yet they find reasons to work late, to visit friends, to reorganize their garage, to scroll through their phone for hours before bed, anything and everything except having the conversation they know needs to happen. And this pattern continues week after week, month after month, while the underlying tension only grows heavier and more suffocating with each passing day. Or imagine the student who understands that their anxiety about an upcoming exam would diminish significantly if they simply began studying, yet they postpone opening their textbook, convincing themselves that there is always more time, that they work better under pressure, that one more day of rest will somehow make the task feel less overwhelming, when in reality each day of avoidance only multiplies the dread and solidifies the procrastination. Avoidance operates as a psychological mechanism where we consciously or unconsciously remove ourselves from situations, conversations, decisions, or feelings that produce discomfort, pain, or anxiety, and the mechanism works precisely because it provides immediate relief, a quick dopamine hit of escape that rewards the behavior and reinforces it for next time. The mind learns that turning away from the difficult thing makes the difficult feeling go away, at least temporarily, and this creates a powerful feedback loop where avoidance becomes the default response, the path of least resistance that our nervous system automatically selects. What makes avoidance particularly insidious is that we have normalized it entirely within our culture, creating elaborate justifications and reframes that allow us to avoid acknowledging that we are avoiding, telling ourselves stories about productivity, self-care, or timing that mask the fundamental truth that we are running from discomfort. Consider the person who receives difficult news, perhaps a job loss or a relationship ending, and responds with a peculiar calm, speaking about the situation as though it were happening to someone else entirely, describing their own pain with the clinical distance of a scientist observing an experiment rather than a participant experiencing genuine suffering. In this moment, the mind has activated emotional detachment, a defense mechanism that creates a psychological buffer between consciousness and the intensity of feeling, allowing a person to function and think clearly when the full weight of emotion might otherwise overwhelm their ability to act. The mechanism operates by dampening the connection between cognitive understanding and emotional response, so that while the person intellectually knows something devastating has occurred, the visceral, embodied experience of that devastation remains distant and muted, almost as if they are observing their own life from behind protective glass. This serves an immediate practical purpose, enabling someone to make rational decisions during crisis, to handle logistics and details that emotional overwhelm would otherwise prevent, and to maintain a sense of control when circumstances feel chaotic and unmanageable. Yet emotional detachment persists long after the crisis has passed, becoming a habitual response even in situations where full engagement of feeling would be appropriate and healing. And we have normalized this response so thoroughly in modern culture that we often celebrate it as strength and resilience, calling it composure or professionalism when someone maintains emotional distance even in intimate relationships or personal moments meant for connection and vulnerability. The detachment that once protected us becomes a wall we carry everywhere, preventing us from accessing not only pain, but also joy, intimacy, and the full spectrum of human connection that requires our emotional presence. Consider the moment when a person finds themselves in conflict with a colleague at work, and rather than examining their own role in the disagreement, they become entirely focused on cataloging the other person's flaws, their history of difficult behavior, their personality defects, and the ways in which everyone else has also noticed how problematic they are, until the entire narrative of the conflict has been repositioned as something that exists entirely outside of themselves. As though they were simply a passive observer caught in the wake of someone else's dysfunction. This is externalization, the psychological process by which internal conflicts, unwanted impulses, unresolved feelings, and personal responsibility are projected outward onto the external world, onto other people, onto circumstances, onto fate itself. Anything that allows the mind to maintain the illusion that the source of distress originates from beyond the boundaries of the self rather than from within. When someone cannot tolerate the anxiety that comes with recognizing their own contribution to a problem, or when they find it intolerable to sit with feelings of guilt or shame, the psyche performs this subtle redirection, moving the spotlight away from internal experience and shining it instead on external targets, on villains and obstacles and unfair circumstances that seem to explain everything without requiring any self-examination. The mechanism functions because it genuinely reduces the immediate discomfort of self-awareness, offering the relief of a coherent narrative that absolves the self of responsibility and agency, at least temporarily. Yet externalization persists even as we grow older and accumulate evidence that the problems we attribute entirely to others often contain seeds of our own participation, our own patterns, our own choices, and we continue to reach for this defense because the alternative, the full confrontation with one's own role in suffering. Imagine a person who has experienced rejection or criticism in a social setting, and rather than processing that experience or seeking clarification about what occurred, they simply remove themselves from the situation entirely, both physically and emotionally. They might stop attending gatherings they once enjoyed, cease reaching out to friends who said something hurtful, or disengage from activities that once brought them joy, all because the possibility of further pain feels intolerable in that moment. This is withdrawal, a defense mechanism where the mind responds to threat or discomfort by creating distance, by stepping back from relationships, environments, or experiences that have become associated with emotional pain or anxiety. The person tells themselves that isolation is safer than engagement, that absence is preferable to potential hurt, and in this way they construct a protective boundary between themselves and the source of their distress. The psychological logic underlying withdrawal is straightforward and even appears reasonable on its surface. If a situation causes pain, removing oneself from that situation should reduce the pain, and this cause and effect relationship feels immediately true to the anxious mind. The mechanism operates as a form of avoidance coping, where the immediate relief of not facing the difficult situation reinforces the behavior, making it feel like the right choice in the moment. What makes withdrawal particularly persistent, however, is that it works too well in the short term. The anxiety does decrease. The uncomfortable feelings do subside when we remove ourselves from triggering circumstances, and this temporary relief becomes its own reward, cementing the pattern deeper into our psychology with each repetition. Imagine a student who has an important exam coming up, and instead of studying consistently throughout the week, they stay up late the night before, exhausting themselves, and then spend the morning of the test feeling foggy and unprepared, telling themselves and everyone around them that they didn't have enough sleep to properly perform, that the circumstances were against them, that they're operating under a handicap. Or consider a professional who has been given a significant project at work, and rather than beginning immediately with focused effort, they procrastinate until the last possible moment, create unnecessary obstacles, or publicly announce how little time they have to complete the task, effectively setting up external barriers that will serve as explanations for anything less than perfect execution. This psychological pattern is called self-handicapping, and it represents a peculiar defensive strategy where people deliberately construct obstacles or create unfavorable conditions for themselves before attempting a challenging task or performance situation. The mechanism operates on a profound psychological principle. If we fail while handicapped, the failure reflects the handicap rather than our actual abilities, thereby protecting our sense of self-worth and competence from the threat that genuine failure would pose. When we succeed despite being handicapped, we gain the additional benefit of appearing even more capable, more resilient, and more naturally talented than we might otherwise seem. The mind essentially trades the potential for optimal performance against the certainty of protecting self-esteem, engaging in what appears to be a losing bargain on the surface, yet one that feels emotionally safer in the moment. What makes this defense mechanism particularly persistent is that it operates largely outside our conscious awareness, masquerading as circumstantial bad luck or poor timing rather than revealing itself as a when we find ourselves in a moment of distress or uncertainty, there exists a profound human tendency to seek out the company of others, to draw closer to those around us, to establish connection even when that connection might not directly solve the problem we face. Imagine a person sitting in a waiting room before receiving difficult news from a doctor, and rather than sitting alone with their thoughts, they call a friend, or they text a family member, or they simply position themselves near other people in that shared space, finding some inexplicable comfort in mere proximity. The anxiety remains unchanged by the presence of these others. The outcome of the medical consultation will not be altered by a conversation with a loved one. Yet the individual persists in this behavior because something within the human psyche recognizes that we are fundamentally social creatures, and that our distress feels somehow more bearable when witnessed or shared by another consciousness. Affiliation operates as a defense mechanism by allowing us to externalize our internal struggles, to distribute the weight of our emotional burden across multiple people rather than bearing it entirely within ourselves. The psychological principle underlying this mechanism is rooted in our evolutionary past, when survival itself depended upon group cohesion and mutual support, when isolation from the tribe meant vulnerability to predation and environmental threats. This ancient neural architecture remains embedded within us, activated automatically whenever our nervous system detects danger or instability, prompting us to huddle closer to others as though their presence might somehow shield us from harm. We have come to accept this as simply how humans are, as a natural expression of our social nature, without fully recognizing that we are deploying affiliation as a sophisticated psychological defense, a way of managing unbearable emotions through connection rather than through Consider the moment when you receive news that would ordinarily demand your attention or emotional response, yet you find yourself unable to generate even the smallest flicker of concern or interest, as though your mind has constructed an invisible barrier between yourself and the information that reaches your awareness. You hear the words, you understand their meaning intellectually, but the emotional weight that should accompany them simply does not arrive, leaving you in a peculiar state of detachment where nothing seems to matter quite as much as it logically should. This is apathy functioning as a psychological defense mechanism, a dampening of emotional responsiveness that emerges when the psyche becomes overwhelmed by circumstances too painful, too demanding, or too chaotic to process with full emotional engagement. The mechanism operates by gradually reducing the intensity of feeling directed toward people, situations, and outcomes that would normally generate concern, worry, grief, or motivation, creating a protective numbness that insulates the mind from the full force of psychological pain or the burden of responsibility. When someone experiences repeated disappointments, uncontrollable circumstances, or prolonged stress, the nervous system learns that emotional investment may lead only to greater suffering, and so apathy becomes the body's way of conserving psychological energy by withdrawing emotional engagement from what cannot be changed or controlled. What makes this defense mechanism particularly interesting is that despite being fundamentally protective in its origin, it often persists even when circumstances improve and emotional engagement would actually be beneficial, as though the mind has forgotten how to reignite the spark of caring that once animated our interactions with the world. Imagine you are sitting in a meeting when your supervisor mentions a project failure that directly implicates you, and suddenly your mind goes completely blank, as though someone has switched off the lights in your consciousness, and you cannot access any of the details, explanations, or even the emotional weight of what was just said. And moments later, when the meeting ends and the immediate threat has passed, the information begins to seep back into your awareness like water returning to a reservoir. This is blocking, a psychological defense mechanism in which the mind literally prevents conscious access to threatening thoughts, memories, or feelings by creating what amounts to a temporary mental barrier, not through repression which operates over longer timescales and deeper layers, but through an immediate and acute interruption of consciousness itself. When confronted with information or stimuli that the psyche deems too dangerous or overwhelming to process in that moment, blocking simply erects a wall between the threatening material and conscious awareness, allowing you to continue functioning without the destabilizing impact of that knowledge. The mechanism operates on a principle of self-preservation through selective unconsciousness, where the mind determines that processing the information now would exceed your psychological capacity to remain functional, and so it simply refuses to let the information through the gateway of consciousness. What makes blocking particularly interesting is its apparent illogicality, because the threatening information does not disappear merely because you cannot consciously acknowledge it. It remains stored somewhere in the neural architecture, yet the conscious mind maintains perfect ignorance of its existence, and we have normalized this phenomenon so thoroughly in our daily experience that we barely notice it occurring, describing it with euphemisms like blanking out or drawing a blank, as though it were a M. Imagine you send an email to your supervisor that contains a small typo, and within minutes your mind begins constructing an elaborate narrative in which this minor error somehow leads to your dismissal, which then cascades into financial ruin, homelessness, and social isolation, all stemming from that single misplaced comma. This is catastrophizing, a psychological defense mechanism wherein the mind takes a relatively minor or uncertain threat and rapidly escalates it into a worst-case scenario of catastrophic proportions. The mechanism operates by allowing anxiety to bypass rational assessment entirely, jumping instead directly to the most extreme possible outcome while treating that imagined outcome as though it were an inevitable certainty rather than a remote possibility. What makes catastrophizing particularly insidious is that it often serves as a protection mechanism, functioning under the illusion that by imagining the worst possible outcome beforehand, we somehow inoculate ourselves against genuine harm or prepare ourselves mentally for disaster. The brain essentially decides that occupying itself with horror scenarios is preferable to sitting with genuine uncertainty, because at least within the catastrophic narrative, there exists the illusion of control and preparation. Yet despite its prevalence and the profound discomfort it generates, catastrophizing persists because we have collectively accepted anxiety as something requiring constant management through increasingly elaborate mental contingency planning. We normalize spending hours constructing detailed disaster narratives as though this mental labor represents responsible foresight rather than recognition of how our anxious minds systematically distort probability and proportionality. The mechanism extracts a substantial cost in sleep quality and daily peace, yet we rarely pause to question whether imagining the worst has ever actually prevented it. Imagine yourself sitting in a meeting at work where your supervisor presents an idea that you immediately recognize as flawed, perhaps even counterproductive to the company's stated goals. Yet when they finish speaking, you find yourself nodding along with the rest of the room, and when asked for your thoughts, you hear yourself offering mild agreement or constructive suggestions rather than voicing your genuine concern that this direction is fundamentally misguided. Later, you might rationalize this behavior by telling yourself that you were being diplomatic or that you didn't want to seem difficult, but the deeper mechanism at work is conformity, a psychological defense that operates by aligning your external behavior and sometimes even your stated beliefs with those of the group around you, regardless of whether this alignment contradicts your private understanding or personal values. This defense mechanism emerges from a profoundly adaptive part of our psychology, rooted in our evolutionary past when belonging to the group quite literally meant survival, when being cast out or marked as different could result in genuine physical danger or resource deprivation. Your brain learned long ago that matching the behavior and beliefs of those around you reduces the social friction that might threaten your place within the community, and this ancient survival instinct remains embedded in your nervous system even in modern contexts where social rejection rarely carries life-or-death consequences. What makes conformity particularly insidious as a psychological defense is that it operates so smoothly beneath conscious awareness that we often don't realize we're employing it at all, and we've built entire social and professional structures that reinforce and reward this tendency, creating environments where nonconformity carries real consequences in terms of promotion, social status, and inclusion, which means that over time, many people internalize conformity. Imagine a person sitting in their office, meticulously organizing their desk for the third time that morning, moving pens and papers into precise geometric arrangements, even though nothing has changed since yesterday and the work itself requires no such order. At home, this same individual might insist on controlling exactly how dishes are loaded into the dishwasher, how family members spend their free time, or the precise timing of household routines, and when others deviate from these carefully constructed systems, a wave of anxiety washes over them that seems disproportionate to the actual circumstances. This is controlling as a psychological defense mechanism, and it emerges from a fundamental human fear of unpredictability and chaos. When life feels uncertain or threatening, when past experiences have shown that the world can be unsafe or that bad things happen without warning, the mind develops an ingenious strategy. If we can control the environment and the people within it, then we can prevent bad outcomes from occurring. By dictating rules, routines, and behaviors in minute detail, the person creates an illusion of safety and predictability, transforming an uncontrollable world into one that responds to their will and design. The mechanism persists because it actually works, at least temporarily and in limited ways, providing immediate relief from anxiety whenever order is imposed and maintained. Yet what makes this defense particularly insidious is how it often damages the very relationships and life satisfaction it was meant to protect, as others experience this controlling behavior as suffocating and restrictive, yet we continue to reinforce these patterns because the short-term comfort they provide feels necessary and even righteous to the person employing them. Imagine you are walking through your day, moving through familiar spaces and engaging in routine activities, yet something feels profoundly disconnected. Your hands appear to belong to someone else as you watch them perform tasks. Your voice seems to come from a distance, as though you are observing yourself speak rather than actually speaking. The world around you takes on a dreamlike quality, where colors seem muted and sounds feel distant, even though logically you know you are present and awake. This is depersonalization, a psychological defense mechanism in which the mind creates a protective distance between your conscious awareness and your immediate experience by making both your body and your surroundings feel unreal or foreign. When the emotional intensity of a situation becomes overwhelming, when trauma threatens to flood the system with unbearable sensations, or when anxiety reaches a crescendo that the mind cannot process, depersonalization activates as a dissociative shield. The mechanism works by essentially dampening the emotional charge of experience, by making reality feel slightly unreal, by introducing a layer of perceptual distance between the self and the world. The mind reduces the immediate impact of what is happening. It is as though consciousness steps back and observes from behind a pane of glass, still aware of events but unable to fully feel their weight. This creates a peculiar paradox where you remain functional, moving through the world and completing necessary tasks, yet simultaneously feel absent from your own life. The mechanism persists in modern experience despite its disorienting nature because it serves its protective function so effectively. We have normalized this experience in subtle ways, accepting occasional feelings of unreality as simply being tired, stressed, or overwhelmed. Imagine standing in a crowded shopping mall on an ordinary afternoon, surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of everyday life, yet everything around you feels strangely distant and unreal, as though you are watching the scene through a thick pane of glass or viewing a movie rather than participating in it directly. And this peculiar sensation of detachment persists even as you consciously recognize that nothing has actually changed about the physical environment itself. Derealization is a psychological defense mechanism in which the mind creates a subtle but profound sense of disconnection from the external world, not through any actual alteration of reality, but through a filtering of perception that renders the environment feel foreign, dreamlike, or somehow less vivid than it should be. And this defensive response typically emerges when the conscious mind encounters information or circumstances that are too overwhelming, too threatening, or too incompatible with one's sense of safety to process in the normal way. The brain, acting with an almost protective intelligence, essentially dampens the emotional resonance and immediacy of the perceived world as a way of reducing the psychological impact of whatever threat or stressor has triggered this response, allowing a person to continue functioning even when their internal state is profoundly disturbed. What is particularly striking about derealization is how it persists in modern life despite our intellectual understanding that it serves no rational purpose. For we continue to experience this sense of unreality in situations where our actual physical safety is not threatened, where no genuine danger exists, and where the perceived threat is often entirely psychological or existential in nature. We have normalized this protective mechanism so thoroughly that many people experience it regularly without ever naming it or questioning why they feel as though they are moving through life like goes. Consider the moment when you find yourself in a crowded room after having made a small mistake, perhaps stumbling over your words during a presentation or laughing a bit too loudly at something that wasn't quite as funny as you initially thought. And you notice that the attention you feared would fixate upon you seems instead to disperse and fade almost immediately as the crowd's collective consciousness moves toward other concerns and distractions. And this gradual dissolving of focus becomes a source of quiet relief as you realize that what felt monumentally embarrassing to you occupies only a fleeting microsecond in the awareness of those around you. Diffusion operates as a psychological mechanism wherein we unconsciously distribute responsibility, blame, or emotional intensity across multiple people, circumstances, or time periods rather than allowing it to concentrate entirely upon ourselves, which serves to reduce the psychological burden we must carry alone. And this process can manifest in various forms, such as when a group makes a poor decision together, and each individual feels somewhat less guilty because the responsibility becomes shared among all participants, or when we recall a painful memory not as a singular defined event, but as part of a broader tapestry of events that week or month or year, thereby weakening its emotional impact through dilution. The mechanism functions because our minds have evolved to seek relief from concentrated psychological pressure, and by spreading an intense emotion or responsibility across multiple shoulders or across extended time, we create the illusion of lightness where heaviness previously existed, yet this process persists even when we recognize its illogical nature, for we continue to feel somewhat less accountable when standing among others who share in the same action or consequence. And we continue to feel somewhat less pain when we contextualize our suffering within the larger narrative of our L. Consider a person who has experienced repeated criticism from a parent during childhood, and now, decades later, when their adult child offers a simple suggestion about their cooking, they immediately interpret it as harsh judgment and rejection of their entire worth as a person. The neutral comment becomes, in their mind, evidence of fundamental inadequacy, and they construct an elaborate narrative where the suggestion proves their child has never respected them and never will. What has occurred here is a fundamental alteration of reality through the psychological mechanism of distortion, wherein the mind reshapes external events, other people's intentions, and objective facts to align with pre-existing painful beliefs and anxieties. Distortion differs from outright denial because the person is not refusing to acknowledge what happened. Rather, they are transforming its meaning and significance into something darker, more threatening, or more personally damaging than the actual situation warrants. The mechanism operates through selective amplification, where certain aspects of reality are magnified while contradictory evidence is minimized or ignored entirely. The brain essentially edits experience as it occurs, filtering information through the lens of deep-seated fears and negative self-concepts, then presents this distorted version back to consciousness as though it were objective truth. Over time, this becomes so automatic that the person develops no awareness they are doing it at all. The distorted interpretation feels like simple perception rather than psychological defense. What makes distortion particularly insidious is its persistence despite how irrational it becomes when examined closely, because each time it operates successfully to reduce anxiety or confirm an existing belief, it becomes reinforced and more likely to activate again. Consider the person who has endured repeated disappointments, chronic stress, or traumatic experiences, and who gradually finds themselves moving through their days with a peculiar absence of feeling, as though they are watching their own life from behind thick glass, observing events that should matter deeply yet finding themselves unable to access the emotional responses that would normally accompany such moments. They receive news that would typically bring joy, yet feel only a muted acknowledgement. They face situations that should provoke anger or sadness, yet experience instead a hollow flatness, a sense of going through the motions without genuine internal resonance. This is emotional numbing, a protective mechanism by which the mind essentially mutes its own capacity for feeling, as though turning down the volume on an internal emotional broadcast so that the intensity of painful stimuli cannot fully penetrate consciousness. The psychological logic underlying this defense is straightforward and initially adaptive. When emotions become too overwhelming, too frequent, or too destabilizing for the psyche to process safely, the mind discovers that reducing emotional reactivity altogether serves as a survival strategy, preventing the individual from being repeatedly battered by waves of pain they feel powerless to control or escape. Over time, however, this same mechanism that once offered protective respite begins to calcify into a habitual pattern, a kind of emotional flattening that persists long after the original threat has passed, leaving individuals caught in a paradox where they are simultaneously safer from emotional pain, yet simultaneously disconnected from the texture and meaning that emotions provide to human experience. We have normalized this state in countless ways, describing emotionally numb individuals as resilient or strong, when in fact they may be suffering from a form of psychological dissociation that, while reducing a foreclosure represents a psychological mechanism wherein an individual prematurely closes off the possibility of experiencing or exploring certain emotions, thoughts, or experiences by adopting a rigid stance of finality before genuinely encountering them. Consider a person who, having experienced one failed romantic relationship, might declare with absolute certainty that they will never fall in love again, effectively shutting down their heart before any new opportunity arrives, or someone who witnesses a single instance of public embarrassment and immediately concludes that they are fundamentally incapable of social interaction, thereby foreclosing on any future attempts at connection before giving themselves a genuine chance to try. The mechanism operates through a paradoxical logic wherein the mind attempts to protect itself from potential future pain by preemptively closing the door on possibility itself, transforming what might have been an open question into a settled matter of supposed fact. This defensive maneuver offers a peculiar form of psychological relief, because once something is declared finished or impossible, the individual no longer needs to hold the anxiety of uncertainty, negotiation, or the vulnerability that comes with genuine openness to change and growth. The mind finds strange comfort in finality, even a finality that is self-imposed and logically baseless, because certainty, even devastating certainty about one's limitations, paradoxically feels safer than the genuine uncertainty of what might actually be possible. Yet this mechanism persists as a normalized response to disappointment and difficulty, as though closing doors permanently is somehow equivalent to wisdom rather than fear, and as though declaring something impossible before truly attempting it represents maturity rather than avoidance of the profound vulnerability that authentic engagement with life requires. Consider the person who, having made a single successful presentation at work, begins to speak of themselves as an exceptional visionary destined for greatness, despite years of ordinary performance and unremarkable achievements that preceded this moment. Consider, too, the individual who, after reading several books on a particular subject, now feels qualified to lecture experts and dismisses contrary opinions as products of inferior intellect, or the social media user who carefully curates every image and statement to portray a life of extraordinary importance and accomplishment, though their daily existence remains largely unremarkable and filled with the same mundane struggles that characterize most human lives. Grandiosity operates as a psychological defense mechanism by elevating one's self-perception far beyond what evidence would reasonably support, creating an inflated sense of superiority, importance, and capability that serves to protect the underlying self from feelings of inadequacy, shame, or insignificance. When the psyche encounters threats to its esteem or confronts evidence of limitation and ordinariness, grandiosity functions as a counterbalance, an exaggeration that pushes back against vulnerability by constructing an alternative narrative in which the self remains exceptional, powerful, and deserving of special recognition. The mechanism persists because it provides genuine psychological comfort in the moment, offering relief from the discomfort of confronting one's genuine limitations and mortality, yet it simultaneously distances the person from authentic connection and realistic self-understanding. We have increasingly normalized this defense mechanism through cultural systems that reward self-promotion and constant assertion of achievement, creating environments where subtle grandiosity appears not as psychological distortion, but as healthy confidence and justified self-advocacy. Consider the person who finds themselves in a situation where they have genuinely exhausted their options, where every reasonable avenue for change has been explored and found wanting, where the external circumstances pressing down upon them feel immovable and absolute. In these moments, a peculiar psychological shift occurs, one that extends far beyond the rational assessment of actual powerlessness, creeping into territories where the mind begins to organize itself around the assumption that nothing can be done, that struggle itself is futile, and that passivity becomes not merely an option but an inevitable state. The defense mechanism of helplessness operates as a kind of psychological surrender, a lowering of expectations and effort that paradoxically protects the individual from the repeated disappointment of trying and failing, from the emotional exhaustion of confronting genuine limitations. When someone has encountered repeated failures in a particular domain, the mind begins to construct narratives where future attempts are predetermined to fail, where the effort itself becomes pointless, and where conservation of emotional energy takes precedence over action. This creates a circular pattern where reduced effort leads to worse outcomes, which then confirms the belief that effort was indeed meaningless, reinforcing the helplessness further still. Yet what remains remarkable about this mechanism is how thoroughly it persists even in situations where circumstances have fundamentally changed, where new options have emerged, where different approaches might yield different results, and where the original conditions of powerlessness no longer apply with the same weight. We have normalized helplessness as a response to overwhelming situations, treating it as a reasonable and even wise adaptation, when in truth it often represents the mind's protective mechanism taken to an extreme, a shutdown of possibility itself that continues long after the eye. Consider the child who grows up with a parent who is emotionally distant, inconsistently available, or perhaps even subtly harmful through neglect or criticism. Yet the child constructs an internal narrative in which that parent is fundamentally good, wise, and entirely well-intentioned, attributing any painful interactions to misunderstandings or to the child's own failings rather than acknowledging the parent's limitations. This phenomenon represents idealization of parents, a psychological defense mechanism wherein we preserve a protective fantasy of parental perfection that allows us to maintain emotional safety and attachment during developmentally crucial years when we cannot afford to fully recognize or accept our caregiver's profound flaws. The mechanism operates by selectively filtering perception, amplifying the positive qualities of parents while systematically minimizing or reinterpreting negative experiences as isolated incidents rather than patterns of behavior, allowing the child to maintain the cognitive framework that their parents are fundamentally loving and capable even when evidence consistently suggests otherwise. Psychologically, this defense serves a critical function because acknowledging deep parental inadequacy creates an unbearable internal conflict for a dependent child who has no choice but to rely on these caregivers for survival. So the mind protects itself by rewriting history into a more tolerable narrative. What persists into adulthood is particularly striking because even as we gain independence and perspective, many individuals continue to hold idealized versions of parents despite accumulating evidence that challenges these carefully constructed images, suggesting that this defense mechanism becomes so deeply woven into our sense of self and family identity that dismantling it feels threatening to our entire psychological foundation. And thus we preserve the illusion long past the point where it served. Consider the moment when a child watches their parent navigate a difficult social interaction with grace and composure, and then weeks later finds themselves mirroring that exact same tone and posture when facing a similar challenge, even though they have never consciously decided to adopt these behaviors. This is imitation as a psychological defense mechanism, where we unconsciously model ourselves after others as a way of managing anxiety, uncertainty, and the fundamental human fear of being inadequate or unprepared for the world around us. When we encounter situations that feel overwhelming or foreign, our minds instinctively reach for a template that already exists in our memory, a blueprint of someone else's successful navigation through comparable circumstances, and we adopt their mannerisms, their speech patterns, their emotional responses as though they were our own authentic reactions. The mechanism operates beneath conscious awareness most of the time, allowing us to borrow confidence and competence from others when our own reserves feel depleted. And in doing so, we reduce the psychological burden of having to generate entirely new responses from scratch in moments of stress. We imitate role models, authority figures, peers, and even characters from stories and films, absorbing their ways of being into our own identity matrix as a form of psychological scaffolding that helps us stand taller than we might otherwise feel capable of standing. What makes imitation particularly persistent as a defense mechanism is that it often succeeds, at least superficially, in reducing our immediate anxiety and helping us move through threatening situations without complete emotional collapse. And yet we rarely acknowledge that we are doing it at all, treating our imitated behaviors as though they emerged organically from our own depths, rather than recognizing them as borrowed armor. Consider the moment when a child witnesses their parent displaying a particular mannerism, perhaps the way they tilt their head when listening intently or the specific cadence of their laugh. And then years later, that same child finds themselves doing exactly the same thing without ever consciously deciding to adopt it, moving through the world with gestures and speech patterns and ways of being that feel entirely their own, yet belong to someone else entirely. This is incorporation, the psychological process through which we internalize external qualities, attributes, behaviors, and even entire belief systems from other people, particularly those we admire or feel close to, weaving them into the fabric of our own identity so thoroughly that we can no longer distinguish where they came from or recognize them as separate from ourselves. The mechanism operates through a kind of unconscious imitation that goes far deeper than simple mimicry, functioning as a way for us to maintain connection with important figures in our lives by literally becoming more like them, carrying them forward not just in our memories, but embedded within our own personalities and mannerisms. When we incorporate aspects of another person, we are essentially absorbing them into our psychological structure, making their qualities our qualities, their values our values, and this process allows us to feel less alone, less abandoned, less separate from those we love or need, because in some fundamental way they now exist within us. The mechanism persists across our entire lifespan, from the earliest moments of childhood when we learn who to be by watching our caregivers, through adolescence when we incorporate traits from our peers and heroes, into adulthood when we continue to absorb qualities from our partners, mentors, and even casual acquaintances. And we rarely notice this happening because incorporation feels natural and seamless, like organic growth rather than psychological. Consider the person who arrives late to work repeatedly and when questioned, immediately explains that the traffic was unusually heavy, that their alarm malfunctioned, that they had an unexpected family obligation, or that the bus system was running behind schedule. Each explanation feels reasonable in the moment, yet the pattern continues week after week, and the underlying issue remains unaddressed. What has occurred is justification, a psychological defense mechanism, wherein we provide rational explanations or reasons for our thoughts, feelings, behaviors, or decisions, in order to make them seem more acceptable, defensible, or logically sound to ourselves and others. The mechanism operates by constructing a narrative framework around our actions that transforms them from potentially problematic or embarrassing into understandable and even inevitable responses to external circumstances. When we justify, we are essentially reframing reality through a lens that emphasizes mitigating factors, contextual pressures, and reasonable constraints, thereby reducing the psychological discomfort that might arise from acknowledging our own responsibility or limitations. This defense mechanism is particularly effective because it does not require us to deny what happened or to forget the event entirely, as we do in repression or suppression. Instead, it allows us to fully remember and discuss the incident while simultaneously feeling absolved of genuine accountability. Over time, justification becomes so normalized in human discourse that we rarely question why we do it or recognize when we are engaged in it, as we have developed an almost unconscious ability to generate plausible explanations for nearly any behavior or circumstance. The persistence of justification, despite its logical transparency, reveals something profound about human psychology. We are motivated not primarily by truth or accuracy, but by psychological comfort and the maintenance of a co. Imagine yourself lying in bed at night, unable to sleep, and you find yourself thinking that if you can just count to 100 without losing focus, tomorrow will bring good news, or that if you arrange your pillows in a particular way, you might finally feel at peace, or that by visualizing a specific outcome with enough intensity, you can somehow influence reality to bend toward your desire. This is magical thinking, a psychological defense mechanism in which we attribute causal relationships between our thoughts, actions, or rituals and external events, despite having no logical basis for believing such connections exist. When we employ magical thinking, we essentially tell ourselves that our internal mental processes possess an almost supernatural power to shape the world around us, transforming us from passive observers of our circumstances into active architects of fate, even when we consciously know this is not how reality functions. The mechanism serves a profound psychological purpose by restoring a sense of agency and control to situations where we genuinely feel powerless, anxious, or uncertain about outcomes we cannot actually influence. A student might wear the same lucky socks to every exam, genuinely believing that the garment somehow enhances their cognitive abilities, or someone facing serious illness might convince themselves that positive thinking alone can overcome medical reality. And in both cases, the magical thinking operates as a psychological shield against the overwhelming anxiety of helplessness. What makes this defense mechanism particularly persistent is that it often coexists with our rational understanding of probability and causality. We simultaneously know that rituals cannot change reality while behaving as though they absolutely can. Imagine a person who has begun to notice that whenever they face a particularly difficult meeting at work or a social obligation they find deeply uncomfortable, a peculiar ailment seems to manifest with remarkable timing. A sudden headache that feels genuine enough, a fatigue that settles into their bones, or perhaps a vague digestive complaint that makes attending the event genuinely inconvenient. The person themselves might not consciously recognize what is happening, though on some level, they understand that their body has provided them with an escape route, a legitimate seeming reason to withdraw from the situation without having to openly acknowledge their anxiety or reluctance. This is malingering, the psychological defense mechanism by which an individual consciously or semi-consciously fabricates, exaggerates, or prolongs physical or mental symptoms in order to avoid an unwanted situation, gain sympathy, secure attention, or obtain some external benefit such as time off work or relief from responsibility. The mechanism works because the mind and body are inextricably linked, and the psychological stress of avoidance can sometimes manifest as genuine physical sensations that feel entirely real to the person experiencing them. What distinguishes malingering from genuine illness is the underlying motivation. The symptoms serve a purpose beyond themselves, they solve a problem, they provide an exit strategy from something the person finds intolerable or threatening. Over time, this defense mechanism can become habitual, almost reflexive, so that a person finds themselves reaching for illness as naturally as reaching for a familiar tool. Despite our modern understanding of psychology and the general acknowledgement that avoidance coping strategies are ultimately counterproductive, malingering persists as a surprisingly common defense mechanism because it offers immediate relief from psychological distress. It carries less social stigma than directal. Consider the person who remains in a painful relationship, not because they lack the ability to leave, but because some unconscious part of them has come to associate suffering with love, devotion, or redemption. And so they unconsciously seek out situations that perpetuate their own emotional or physical discomfort as a way of reinforcing a deeply held belief about their own worthiness. Masochism, as a psychological defense mechanism, operates through a peculiar inversion of pain itself, transforming what would ordinarily be experienced as purely harmful into something that feels deserved, meaningful, or even necessary for survival. When a person has internalized the belief that they are fundamentally unworthy of kindness or safety, they may unconsciously construct scenarios in which they suffer, because suffering becomes proof of something they can control, a way of predicting pain before it arrives unexpectedly from the outside world, and thus a paradoxical mechanism of psychological protection. The mechanism persists because it converts helplessness into a twisted form of agency, allowing the individual to believe that their pain is self-inflicted rather than inflicted upon them by circumstance or others, which provides an illusion of control that feels safer than acknowledging genuine vulnerability. We see this reflected in how people often sabotage their own happiness, punish themselves for minor mistakes far beyond what any reasonable person would consider proportionate, or remain in situations that clearly diminish their well-being, all while feeling that they somehow deserve these outcomes. What makes this defense mechanism particularly resilient is that it becomes self-reinforcing and normalized within the architecture of someone's identity, where suffering itself becomes intertwined with their sense of loyalty, responsibility, or moral character, making it extraordinarily difficult to recognize that they are actively choosing pain as a salutio. Consider the adult who finds themselves seeking guidance, reassurance, or practical support from a trusted figure in their life, whether that person is a parent, partner, mentor, or close friend, and notice how this reliance feels neither desperate nor immature, but rather like a natural and healthy exchange of resources within a reciprocal relationship. Mature dependence emerges as a psychological mechanism wherein a person consciously acknowledges their genuine needs for support, connection, and assistance without experiencing shame or a sense of diminished autonomy. And importantly, they extend the same care and reliability to others in return, creating a balanced dynamic that resembles interdependence rather than one-directional neediness. This represents a significant developmental achievement because it reflects the integration of early dependency patterns with adult capability, allowing someone to ask for help when genuinely needed while maintaining their sense of competence and self-worth in other domains of their life. The mechanism operates through a kind of honest self-assessment where a person recognizes that human beings are fundamentally social creatures designed for connection and mutual support, and that needing others is not a failure of independence, but rather an expression of realistic understanding about the human condition and our genuine limitations. What makes mature dependence distinct from regression or helpless dependency is the element of choice and reciprocity, because the person maintains agency in their relationships, can express their needs clearly, can tolerate temporary periods of independence when necessary, and actively contributes to the well-being of those upon whom they depend. This mechanism persists as a fundamental aspect of psychological health precisely because it acknowledges an essential truth that pure independence is neither possible nor desirable in human life, and yet our cultural narratives so of. Consider the student who has been struggling with a decision about their future for months, unable to commit to a career path, a major or a significant life choice. And so instead of making any decision at all, they simply pause, they suspend all forward movement, they declare an unofficial moratorium on the need to choose until some undefined future moment when clarity might arrive on its own. Consider the person in a troubled relationship who recognizes deep incompatibilities and fundamental problems, yet instead of addressing them directly or making a choice to leave or stay, they enter into a kind of psychological suspension where they neither fully commit to fixing things nor take steps toward ending it, instead existing in a prolonged state of waiting, of intentional postponement, of deciding not to decide. The moratorium is the defense mechanism by which we temporarily halt our engagement with a threatening decision, a challenging commitment, or a difficult reality by simply choosing to pause, to delay, to suspend action indefinitely under the premise that we need more information, more time, or more certainty before we can possibly move forward. What makes this mechanism psychologically compelling is how reasonable it sounds on the surface, how it borrows the language of prudence and wisdom, how it masquerades as thoughtfulness when it is actually avoidance dressed in patient clothing. We delay confronting a health concern because we tell ourselves we need another opinion. We postpone a difficult conversation because the timing is not quite right. We suspend judgment on important relationships because we believe more time will bring clarity, yet the moratorium persists not because these justifications are false exactly, but because they are perfectly designed to never be fully satisfied, because there will always be another reason to wait, another condition that must be met. Another moment when we might finally be ready. Narcissism as a psychological defense mechanism emerges when an individual constructs an inflated sense of self-importance and superiority in response to deep-seated feelings of inadequacy, shame, or vulnerability. Consider the person who dominates conversations by steering every topic back to their own accomplishments, who requires constant admiration and validation from others, and who becomes disproportionately angry when their achievements are not sufficiently acknowledged or when someone else receives praise instead. In real-life scenarios, this manifests as the colleague who takes credit for team projects, the acquaintance who constantly name-drops their connections and possessions, or the family member who needs to be the center of attention at every gathering, often by belittling others' experiences or accomplishments to maintain their elevated position. The psychological mechanism at work is fundamentally a protective shield, a fortress built around a fragile core self that fears being perceived as ordinary, flawed, or unworthy of love and respect. By projecting an image of superiority and entitlement, the narcissistic defense deflects attention away from internal doubts and insecurities that the person cannot tolerate consciously acknowledging. The grandiose presentation serves to regulate unstable self-esteem by seeking external validation and admiration, which temporarily fills the emotional void created by deep self-doubt. What persists despite its obvious costs is the way narcissistic defenses can appear successful in the short term, earning social status, professional advancement, or material gains that seem to validate the inflated self-image, reinforcing the pattern. We have also normalized many mild narcissistic traits in modern culture, celebrating self-promotion, personal branding, and competitive individualism in ways that blur the line between healthy self-care and defensive narcissism, making it increasingly difficult to reckon. Consider the moment when someone asks you a simple question, perhaps something as straightforward as whether you would like to go for a walk or try a new restaurant. And instead of engaging with the actual proposal, you find yourself immediately presenting all the reasons why it cannot be done, why it would not work, why the timing is wrong, or why the idea itself is fundamentally flawed. This reflexive opposition to suggestions, requests, or even possibilities, regardless of their actual merit, represents a psychological defense mechanism known as negativism. The individual does not necessarily dislike walking or trying new foods, yet something within the psyche compels them to reject the proposition outright, to assume a contrarian stance that opposes rather than considers. This mechanism functions as a way to maintain a sense of autonomy and control by resisting external influence, by asserting that one cannot be moved or persuaded or directed by others, even when those others mean well or when acceptance might bring genuine pleasure. The underlying logic suggests that by saying no first, by taking the opposing position, one preserves agency and prevents the uncomfortable feeling of being controlled or dominated by another person's will. It becomes a preemptive strike against vulnerability, a way of ensuring that one's decisions feel self-determined rather than externally imposed. Yet what makes negativism particularly interesting is how it persists despite the obvious cost it extracts. The person practicing this defense sacrifices experiences, opportunities, and connections in service of maintaining this protective stance, and often they are not even aware they are doing it. The automatic rejection becomes so habitual that it feels like authentic preference rather than defensive reaction. And over time, the person may genuinely believe they simply dislike these things rather than recognizing their resistance as a shield against perceived threats. Consider the person who has experienced a significant loss or failure, yet finds themselves believing with unwavering certainty that they could have prevented it through sheer force of will, through better planning, through greater effort, or through some special quality they possess that simply went unused in that particular moment. A parent whose child becomes ill believes that had they been more vigilant, more intuitive, more spiritually attuned, they could have sensed the danger before it arrived. A professional who loses a major opportunity becomes convinced that they possessed all the necessary talent and connections to secure it, and that only some mysterious personal flaw prevented them from manifesting their obvious superiority into tangible success. This is omnipotence as a psychological defense mechanism, and it operates by allowing the mind to preserve a sense of control and agency in situations where control was never actually available. The mechanism functions through a peculiar inversion of powerlessness into power, where the individual unconsciously converts their helplessness into a distorted narrative of responsibility and potential mastery. Rather than accepting that random circumstance, biological chance, or forces beyond individual comprehension determine outcomes, the mind insists that the self is the primary determining force, even if that force was somehow inhibited, misdirected, or insufficiently mobilized. This preserves the psyche from the deeper terror of genuine powerlessness, replacing it with a more manageable form of self-blame that at least suggests that next time, with greater awareness or effort, the outcome could be different. The person unconsciously chooses guilt or self-recrimination over the acceptance of their own fundamental limitations and mortality. Consider the person who grew up feeling inadequate or powerless in a particular domain, perhaps someone whose parents constantly criticized their athletic abilities or intellectual capabilities, and who now channels enormous energy into becoming exceptionally skilled in that very area, driven by an unconscious need to prove their worth and silence the internal voice of doubt that still whispers from childhood. This is overcompensation, a psychological defense mechanism in which we invest disproportionate effort, attention, or resources into counteracting a perceived weakness or inferiority, transforming the source of our shame into a source of pride and identity. The mechanism operates at a subtle but powerful level because it takes a genuine wound and converts it into motivation, making what might otherwise be paralysis into productivity, which means the person often achieves real competence and genuine success. Yet the underlying insecurity remains untouched beneath the surface of their accomplishment. We see this in the workaholic who grew up poor, accumulating wealth and status as if each dollar could insulate them from the memory of scarcity, or in the overly generous person compensating for their own emotional coldness, or in the individual who becomes aggressively confident to mask profound self-doubt. The psychological mechanism works because overcompensation allows us to feel as though we are addressing the problem while simultaneously avoiding confronting the actual emotional pain or belief that generated it, creating an illusion of resolution that keeps the original wound sealed away in darkness. What sustains overcompensation despite its obvious inefficiency is that it produces tangible external results and social rewards, which reinforces the behavior while leaving the internal conflict undisturbed. So we continue pushing harder, achieving more, yet finding that no amount of accomplishment quite satisfies the nameless hunger that Imagine a therapist who has spent 20 years helping trauma survivors process their deepest wounds, and slowly, imperceptibly, the therapist begins to see their own unresolved trauma reflected in every client's story, until the boundaries between helper and help become blurred, and the therapist finds themselves unable to maintain professional distance because they have become so thoroughly merged with the suffering they witness. Or consider a parent who lost a sibling in childhood and now hovers over their own children with such intensity that they cannot distinguish between protecting their children and reliving their own grief, their identity so fused with the role of guardian that stepping back feels like abandonment. Over-identification occurs when we merge so completely with another person, a role, an ideal, or a cause that our sense of self becomes indistinguishable from the object of our identification. And in this fusion, we lose the perspective that comes from healthy separation and boundaries. The mechanism operates through a kind of psychological osmosis, where we don't simply empathize with or support something external, but rather we absorb it into our core identity so thoroughly that we can no longer see where we end and it begins. We tell ourselves that this total identification proves our commitment, our authenticity, our genuine care, yet what we have actually done is use identification as a defense against the anxiety that arises when we acknowledge our own separateness and limitations. By becoming one with the other, we avoid the discomfort of recognizing that we cannot fix everything, save everyone, or be everything to those we love. And despite understanding intellectually that boundaries are healthy and necessary, we continue to practice this kind of engulfing identification because it offers a compelling illusion of purpose, connection, and meaning that feels far more substantial than the modest reality of simply being. Consider the student who spends 6 hours perfecting a single paragraph of an essay, rewriting sentences that are already clear and competent, adjusting word choices that made sense in their original form, because something about the work still feels incomplete or inadequate despite receiving consistent praise from teachers. Consider the professional who remains at the office until 9 in the evening to triple-check a presentation that has already been thoroughly reviewed by colleagues, who finds themselves unable to leave until every slide meets an internal standard that exists nowhere but in their own mind. Consider the person organizing their home who reorganizes the same shelf multiple times, each iteration theoretically better than the last, yet never quite reaching the imagined state of absolute order that exists only as a perpetually receding target. Perfectionism operates as a psychological defense mechanism that transforms legitimate effort and care into an exhausting, endless loop where the goalpost continuously moves beyond reach. The underlying mechanism functions to protect the individual from the vulnerability of being judged, criticized, or found wanting by attempting to create an impeccable exterior that leaves no room for legitimate critique. If the work is perfect, or nearly perfect, or approaching perfect, then rejection or judgment becomes theoretically impossible, and the self remains shielded from the pain of inadequacy. Yet perfectionism persists even when we understand intellectually that perfection is unattainable, that flaws are universal, that good enough is genuinely sufficient for most human endeavors. We continue polishing what is already functional, continue raising standards just beyond our current achievement, continue using endless refinement as both a shield and a prison, normalizing this exhausting standard as simply being someone who cares deeply about quality rather than recognizing it as anxiety masquerading. Consider the moment when someone asks you a simple question and you find yourself continuing to explain the same point repeatedly, each time with slightly different wording, unable to shift your mental focus toward anything else despite recognizing that you have already provided a sufficient answer. This is perseveration, a psychological defense mechanism where the mind becomes locked into a particular thought, behavior, or pattern of speech, and continues repeating it with a kind of mechanical persistence that seems almost involuntary. The mechanism typically emerges when we encounter anxiety or uncertainty about whether we have adequately communicated our position or understood something correctly. And so we cycle through the same cognitive content again and again, as though repetition might somehow provide the reassurance we are seeking. It is as if the mind becomes stuck in a groove, like a record player needle that cannot move forward along the vinyl, and each rotation through the same material feels necessary, even though logically we understand that nothing new is being generated. The underlying psychological mechanism functions as both a defense against accepting that a topic is closed or resolved, and simultaneously as an attempt to control our environment through exhaustive repetition, as though enough iterations of the same explanation might finally produce the outcome we desire. What is particularly interesting about perseveration is how the person engaging in it often maintains awareness that they are repeating themselves, yet they continue anyway, caught between the rational knowledge that they should stop and the emotional compulsion that keeps them circling back to the same material. This defense mechanism can persist in our daily lives across countless mundane situations, from explaining the same work concern to a colleague multiple times, to mentally rehearsing an awkward conversation repeatedly before sleep, to getting stuck on a pee. Consider the moment when someone asks you to do something you genuinely do not want to do, yet you find yourself agreeing anyway, your voice steady, and your smile reassuring even as internal resistance churns quietly beneath the surface. You might be exhausted from work, depleted of emotional resources, uncertain about your own needs, and yet when a friend requests your time or a family member asks for a favor or a colleague needs assistance with a project, you hear yourself saying yes with a warmth that feels almost automatic. This is pleasing others as a psychological defense mechanism, a deeply ingrained behavioral pattern wherein you prioritize the comfort, satisfaction, and approval of other people above your own authentic desires, boundaries, and well-being. The mechanism operates by creating a protective shell around your true self, allowing you to navigate social environments by becoming what others need you to be rather than what you actually are. At its foundation lies a complex fear, often rooted in early experiences where love or safety felt conditional, where acceptance depended upon being agreeable, helpful, accommodating, and never burdensome or demanding. Your nervous system learned that keeping others happy meant keeping yourself safe, that rejection or abandonment could be prevented through perfect compliance and perpetual agreeableness. Over time, this pattern becomes so naturalized that you may no longer recognize when you are compromising yourself, when you are exhausting your reserves, when you are abandoning your own needs in service to others' comfort. The mechanism persists because it often appears to work, at least superficially. People like you when you are accommodating. Relationships seem smoother when conflict is avoided. Workplaces reward those who go the extra mile. Consider the experience of meeting someone new who captures your attention, perhaps a romantic interest or a mentor figure, and notice how your mind immediately constructs an almost flawless image of this person, filtering out any signs of ordinary human limitation or imperfection that might emerge in the early stages of interaction. You find yourself remembering their kindest words with crystalline clarity while forgetting entirely the moments they were dismissive or self-absorbed, and you attribute noble motives to their actions even when simpler explanations might suffice, seeing in them qualities of wisdom, strength, or moral superiority that seem almost radiant in comparison to the flawed people around you. This mental process, which psychologists call primitive idealization, represents a defensive splitting of perception in which another person is mentally elevated to an almost mythical status, becoming a repository for all the positive qualities you secretly wish to possess or believe you desperately need, while simultaneously keeping at a safe distance any awareness of their genuine ordinariness or the ways they might eventually disappoint you. The mechanism works by allowing you to borrow a sense of safety or worth through proximity to this idealized figure, as though their perceived perfection might somehow elevate your own sense of self or protect you from the anxiety of depending on someone fundamentally human and therefore unreliable. What makes this defense particularly persistent despite its obvious logical fragility is that it serves such a powerful emotional function, offering temporary relief from the unbearable reality that all people, including those we most need, contain within themselves the capacity for failure and rejection and selfishness. Consider the moment when you become aware of a task that requires your attention, perhaps an email that needs responding to, a project with a looming deadline, or a difficult conversation you know you must eventually have. And yet in that moment of awareness, you find yourself choosing instead to attend to something else entirely, something smaller, something more immediately gratifying, something that pulls your attention away from the larger responsibility at hand. This is procrastination, and it operates as a psychological defense mechanism by allowing us to temporarily escape the anxiety, discomfort, or emotional weight associated with a particular task by redirecting our focus and energy toward activities that feel more manageable or rewarding in the present moment. The mechanism functions because the task itself carries some form of psychological burden. It might be the fear of failure, the pressure of high expectations, the simple boredom of repetitive work, or the overwhelming sense that the task is simply too large to begin. By postponing the task, we also postpone the anxiety it triggers, creating an immediate sense of relief that reinforces the behavior. We tell ourselves we work better under pressure, that we need more time to think, that the conditions are not yet right, that we will begin tomorrow or next week. And each of these justifications serves to rationalize our avoidance while protecting us from the uncomfortable emotions we would face if we engaged directly with the work. The paradox of procrastination lies in the fact that while it provides temporary emotional relief, it inevitably creates greater anxiety later as deadlines approach, and the task remains undone. Yet despite understanding this logical contradiction, despite knowing intellectually that delaying only compounds our stress, we continue to engage in procrastination with remarkable consistency, suggesting that the immediate emotional benefit of avoidance outweigh. Consider a situation where someone becomes intensely critical of a colleague, convinced that this colleague is manipulative, selfish, and unable to empathize with others. Yet when you observe the interactions carefully, you notice that the critic themselves demonstrates these very qualities in their own behavior. They insist that they are pointing out objective flaws in the other person's character, remaining genuinely convinced of their perceptions despite contradictory evidence, and they may even unconsciously encourage or provoke the very behaviors they claim to despise, as though they are drawing out these traits from the other person through their own actions and accusations. This is projective identification, a complex psychological mechanism in which we unconsciously attribute our own disowned impulses, desires, or characteristics onto another person, and then interact with that person in ways that actually elicit or reinforce those very qualities, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that confirms our original projection. The mechanism operates on multiple levels simultaneously. First, we deny or repress an aspect of ourselves that feels unacceptable or threatening to our self-image. Then we attribute that quality to someone else with complete conviction. And finally, we treat that person in ways designed to evoke the behavior we have projected onto them, often through subtle provocations, accusations, or boundary violations that push them toward expressing exactly what we have accused them of being. What makes projective identification particularly persistent and insidious is that, unlike simple projection, which merely involves attributing our traits to others without further interaction, projective identification creates a feedback loop where our behavior toward the other person actually shapes them into embodying our projections, making our original perception feel validated and real rather than constructed. Consider the person who volunteers extensively at a nonprofit organization, spending countless hours helping others in need, yet whose primary motivation is neither compassion nor genuine concern for those being served, but rather a deep-seated need for validation, recognition, and the admiration of their peers. This individual may post photographs of their charitable work across social media, ensure that colleagues are aware of their volunteer status, and subtly remind others of their generous contributions during conversations, all while maintaining an outward appearance of humility and selflessness. The mechanism at work here is a psychological defense known as pseudo-altruism, wherein the individual unconsciously channels their own unmet emotional needs, wounded self-esteem, or feelings of inadequacy into seemingly noble and selfless acts. Rather than directly addressing their hunger for recognition or their need to feel valuable and important, they construct an elaborate narrative in which they are a generous and caring person whose actions are purely motivated by concern for others. The behavior allows them to simultaneously satisfy their narcissistic needs while avoiding the guilt and shame that might accompany the explicit pursuit of attention or status. What makes this defense mechanism particularly resilient is that it operates in a space where genuine altruism and self-interested motivation become nearly indistinguishable. Society actively celebrates and rewards charitable giving and volunteer work, creating an environment where pseudo-altruistic behavior receives the same praise and recognition as truly selfless acts. The individual is rewarded at every turn, which reinforces the defense and makes it increasingly difficult for them to recognize or acknowledge the underlying self-serving motivations. Psychotic denial represents one of the most extreme and disorienting defense mechanisms available to the human psyche, a state in which an individual rejects not merely an emotional truth or an uncomfortable memory, but rather an entire shared reality that exists in the external world around them. Consider the person who receives a terminal medical diagnosis from multiple physicians, holds the written reports in their hands, yet remains absolutely convinced that nothing is wrong with their body, that the doctors are mistaken or conspiring against them, that they will live forever precisely as they are now. This is not simple denial of an unpleasant fact. This is a fundamental reorganization of what is real and what is not, a wholesale rejection of consensual reality itself in favor of an alternative framework that protects the self from unbearable psychological pain. The mechanism operates by severing the connection between perception and belief, creating what is sometimes called a delusional system, wherein the person constructs an elaborate internal logic that explains away all contradicting evidence through increasingly complex rationalizations and alternative interpretations. What makes psychotic denial particularly fascinating is that it typically emerges only under the most extreme circumstances, when the psychological threat posed by reality becomes so catastrophic that the mind essentially chooses to disconnect from objective reality entirely rather than face the implications of what is actually happening. The defense persists because, once established, it becomes self-reinforcing, creating a closed loop in which any evidence that contradicts the denial is immediately reinterpreted or rejected as part of the larger conspiracy or misunderstanding, making the delusional system virtually impervious to logical argument or rational evidence. Consider the moment when someone presents you with a difficult truth, an uncomfortable feedback, or an unwelcome reality that contradicts your self-image or worldview, and you find yourself simply saying, "No, that is not true, that did not happen, or that does not apply to me," not because you have evidence to dispute it, but because the alternative of accepting it feels somehow unbearable. Refusal operates as a psychological defense mechanism wherein an individual rejects an external reality, an internal impulse, or an uncomfortable piece of information outright, without engaging in the cognitive work of processing, analyzing, or integrating that information into their existing framework of understanding. When a person refuses to acknowledge something, they are essentially drawing a line and declaring that particular truth does not exist within their personal reality, even as the world continues to operate according to that very truth they are denying. The mechanism functions by creating a kind of psychological barrier, a sealed boundary between the self and the unwanted knowledge, allowing the person to maintain their current sense of identity, safety, or control without the disruption that honest acknowledgement would bring. What makes refusal particularly persistent, despite its obvious logical limitations, is that it works remarkably well in the short term. The uncomfortable emotion recedes, the threatened sense of self stabilizes, and for a time, the person experiences relief. Over years and decades, this becomes normalized into patterns of thinking where entire categories of experience or feedback simply cease to exist in the person's conscious awareness, not because they disappeared from reality, but because the mind has successfully trained itself not to register them, to refuse them entry into the space where they might require response or change. Consider the person who has spent years in a job that no longer serves them, who arrives each morning knowing their efforts will be met with indifference, whose ideas are consistently dismissed, whose contributions are undervalued, yet who continues to show up, continues to perform their duties with mechanical precision, continues to accept their circumstances as though they were carved into stone rather than constructed by human hands. This is resignation, a psychological mechanism wherein we gradually surrender our sense of agency and possibility, accepting limitations as permanent fixtures of our reality rather than as temporary conditions we might actively work to change. When faced with repeated failures, chronic disappointment, or prolonged exposure to situations that feel beyond our control, the mind eventually arrives at a peculiar conclusion. That struggle itself is futile, that effort produces no meaningful results, and that the path of least resistance is simply to accept what is rather than to envision what might be. The mechanism operates quietly, almost invisibly, as we stop arguing with ourselves about our circumstances and instead internalize the narrative that this is simply how things are, how they have always been, and how they will continue to be. What makes resignation particularly insidious is that it protects us from the acute pain of hope and disappointment simultaneously, creating a kind of emotional numbness that feels safer than vulnerability. Yet we have normalized this response so thoroughly in our modern existence that we rarely question it, speaking of resignation in practical terms as though it were wisdom rather than surrender, describing acceptance as maturity while rarely distinguishing between genuine acceptance and the resigned giving up that masquerades as peace. Imagine a moment when you have caused harm, whether through a careless word, a broken promise, or an action that wounded someone you care about, and in that moment of recognition, a powerful impulse rises within you to repair the damage, to make amends, to restore what was broken by offering something of value in return. This is restitution, a psychological defense mechanism where we attempt to undo or compensate for guilt, shame, or wrongdoing by performing acts of kindness, service, or material compensation toward those we have harmed or toward society more broadly. When someone has acted in ways that contradict their self-image as a good person, restitution provides a pathway to restore their internal sense of morality and integrity, transforming the narrative from perpetrator to helper, from the guilty to the redemptive. The mechanism works through a kind of psychological ledger where we believe that enough good deeds, enough sacrifices, enough visible efforts to help can somehow balance the scales of our transgressions and make us whole again. We see this everywhere in human behavior. The person who was unkind to a friend suddenly showering them with gifts and favors, the individual who made a mistake at work volunteering for extra projects to prove their worth, the parent who missed their child's milestone suddenly becoming hyperattentive and generous. The psychological logic is straightforward and almost mathematical in its appeal, suggesting that guilt can be quantified and erased through sufficient counterbalancing action. Yet what persists despite this apparent rationality is how easily we accept that such transactions can truly resolve the deeper wounds of betrayal or negligence. We have normalized the idea that enough effort, enough time, enough material compensation can genuinely repair ruptures in trust and connection, when in reality the other person may need something far more intangible: genuine acknowledgement, authentic understanding. Consider the moment when someone makes a bold statement in a conversation, perhaps expressing a controversial opinion or sharing a vulnerable confession, only to immediately begin walking it back by adding qualifiers, hedging language, or outright contradictions that soften or negate what they have just said. And notice how this pattern emerges not from any external correction, but from an internal recalibration that happens within seconds of the words leaving their mouth. The person might say something like, "I think my partner doesn't appreciate me enough, but I mean, they're probably just tired from work, and honestly, I'm probably being too sensitive about it anyway," thereby systematically dismantling their own statement piece by piece, until the original assertion has been rendered nearly invisible beneath layers of doubt and self-minimization. Retraction operates as a defensive mechanism wherein the psyche, having ventured into territory that feels unsafe or potentially consequential, immediately sends out a retrieval team to gather back the vulnerable material before it can take root in the external world or be seized upon by others. The mechanism serves to protect against several threats simultaneously: the fear of judgment should others take our words seriously, the anxiety of commitment that comes with stating something definitively, the dread of conflict that might arise if we truly stand by what we have expressed, and the deep discomfort of being truly known as we authentically are. What makes retraction particularly subtle and pervasive is that it operates with such speed and seamlessness that we often do not even recognize we are doing it, and the person retracting may genuinely believe they have expressed themselves fully and clearly when in fact they have strategically neutralized their own message through linguistic withdrawal. Consider the person who has experienced profound rejection in their romantic life, who carries within them a deep fear of abandonment and unworthiness, yet who presents to the world an appearance of supreme confidence and emotional invulnerability, speaking often of their independence and their need for isolation, framing solitude not as a painful necessity, but as a deliberate choice born of superiority rather than self-protection. This individual has engaged in what psychology recognizes as reversal, a defense mechanism wherein an unconscious emotional truth is transformed into its opposite expression, where the vulnerability becomes armor, where the desperate longing for connection metamorphoses into proclaimed indifference to human bonds. The mechanism operates through a kind of psychological inversion where the mind takes an intolerable feeling, one that threatens the stability of the self-concept, and converts it into its polar opposite, allowing the person to express the inverse emotion while remaining unconscious of the original wound beneath it. We see this occur repeatedly in human experience, in the athlete who claims to welcome brutal criticism when internally devastated by it, in the professional who insists they do not care about their career advancement while quietly suffering from each setback, in the person who laughs uproariously at jokes made at their expense while feeling genuine shame in solitude. The persistence of reversal reveals something profound about human consciousness, for we have somehow normalized this fracture between inner experience and outer presentation, accepting that people can successfully convince themselves and others of emotional positions that directly contradict their actual psychological state. We rarely pause to examine how thoroughly this defense has woven itself into our social fabric, how we have created entire cultural narratives that celebrate the inverted expression of pain as strength, how we mistake. Consider the person who finds themselves unable to begin their workday without first arranging their desk in a very specific manner, aligning their keyboard at precisely the right angle, placing their coffee mug in the exact same spot each morning, and touching the corner of their monitor 3 times before opening their email. And when asked why these actions matter, they might struggle to articulate a logical reason. Yet the anxiety that builds when these steps are skipped is undeniable and pressing. Ritualization is a psychological defense mechanism wherein an individual develops a highly structured, repetitive pattern of behavior, often surrounding anxiety-provoking situations or internal distress. and these ritualized actions create the unconscious illusion that chaos has been controlled, that uncertainty has been managed, and that something intangible and threatening has been neutralized through the performance of these precise, orderly steps. The mechanism operates on a profound level because the ritual itself becomes detached from any rational connection to the outcome. Yet the person continues to perform it because the temporary relief experienced when the ritual is completed feels like genuine protection or accomplishment, even though logically they recognize that touching an object 3 times does not actually influence whether a meeting will go well or whether a decision will be sound. What makes ritualization particularly persistent in human psychology is how easily it becomes normalized and even celebrated in certain contexts. As society often rewards and encourages highly structured, disciplined behavior, and the person who meticulously follows their morning routine or maintains elaborate organizational systems might be praised for their dedication and control, when in fact these behaviors may be functioning as anxiety management mechanisms rather than genuine expressions of preference or efficiency. Consider the person who finds themselves deriving pleasure from the discomfort or suffering of another, whether through subtle mockery, deliberate humiliation, or more overtly cruel behavior, and how this response emerges not from genuine malice, but from a complex psychological need to assert dominance, control, or superiority over someone else in a moment where they themselves may feel powerless or diminished. The mechanism operates by transforming internal pain, shame, or feelings of inadequacy into outward expressions of cruelty, allowing the individual to temporarily displace their own psychological distress onto another person, thereby gaining a fleeting sense of power and agency that they cannot secure through more constructive means. When someone mocks a colleague's mistake or finds amusement in another's embarrassment, they are unconsciously attempting to elevate themselves by lowering another, converting their own vulnerability into an illusion of strength and control that feels tangible in that moment. The psychological architecture underlying this defense involves a reversal of roles, where the person who internally experiences themselves as weak, victimized, or shameful becomes the perpetrator rather than the victim, gaining temporary psychological relief through the infliction of minor or major suffering upon someone perceived as even more vulnerable. What makes this particular defense mechanism particularly persistent in human behavior is how readily our social structures can accommodate and even reward such impulses, allowing them to persist beneath layers of justification, humor, competition, or institutional practice, from schoolyard bullying to professional environments where dominance hierarchies are celebrated rather than questioned. We normalize sadistic impulses by framing them as competitiveness, toughness, or realistic assessment of others' weaknesses, thereby allowing this defense mechanism to continue operating without conscious. Consider the person who finds themselves increasingly withdrawn from the social world, not necessarily due to acute social anxiety or traumatic rejection, but rather through a gradual retreat into an elaborate internal landscape of imagination and fantasy that feels safer, more controllable, and infinitely more rewarding than the unpredictable terrain of human connection and intimacy. This mechanism operates when someone begins to invest enormous psychological energy into daydreams, fictional narratives, creative worlds, or imagined relationships that exist entirely within their own mind, creating a parallel reality where they possess greater agency, understanding, and emotional safety than they experience in their actual interactions with others. The psychological logic underlying this defense is remarkably sophisticated. The external world with its social demands, emotional complexities, and potential for rejection or misunderstanding presents genuine threats to psychological stability, whereas the internal fantasy world operates according to rules that the individual can establish and maintain, populated by characters or scenarios that respond predictably to their needs and desires. Over time, this internal world becomes increasingly elaborate and compelling, offering richer emotional texture and more satisfying narrative arcs than the mundane reality of everyday life, which by contrast begins to feel hollow, demanding, and ultimately unsatisfying. What makes schizoid fantasy particularly persistent despite its fundamental disconnection from genuine human intimacy is that it successfully reduces immediate anxiety while simultaneously providing genuine pleasure and a sense of creative mastery that real relationships often cannot match, creating a self-reinforcing cycle where each retreat into fantasy makes the external world feel more threatening and less worth engaging with. Consider the individual who develops a chronic illness or persistent symptom that, while genuinely experienced and uncomfortable, simultaneously provides them with significant benefits in their life that they might not otherwise receive. Perhaps a person experiences debilitating back pain that prevents them from working, yet this condition means they receive disability payments, consistent attention from family members, and a legitimate excuse to avoid responsibilities they found overwhelming. The pain is real, the limitation is genuine, yet the unconscious mind has discovered that this affliction serves multiple purposes beyond the simple experience of suffering. This is secondary gain, the often invisible reward system that our psychology constructs around our difficulties, ailments, and struggles, which then reinforces and perpetuates these very conditions we consciously say we wish to escape. The mechanism operates through a simple, if troubling, calculus. When a symptom or condition provides us with benefits, recognition, support, or relief from demands we find intolerable, our minds unconsciously resist its resolution, even as we consciously desire to be free from it. The back pain brings not just pain but identity, purpose, and a framework through which others understand and relate to us with compassion rather than judgment. A person might maintain anxiety about health because the worry provides structure to their day and justifies their isolation, or they might preserve depression because it absolves them of the responsibility to succeed and perform according to external standards. We have become so accustomed to this paradox in modern life that we seldom question it, accepting without scrutiny that people sometimes seem invested in their own suffering, and we interpret this as weakness or malingering rather than recognizing it as the complex psychological mathematics of secondary gain operating in the background of consciousness. Consider the moment when someone who has spent hours quietly absorbing criticism, judgment, or dismissal suddenly finds themselves speaking up with unexpected firmness, stating their needs, opinions, or boundaries in a way that surprises even themselves. And in doing so, they experience a flood of relief and validation that seems disproportionate to the simple act of having said words aloud. Self-assertion as a psychological defense mechanism represents the unconscious process by which individuals reclaim agency and counteract the accumulated weight of suppression by actively declaring their existence, their right to space, and their refusal to be entirely consumed by the demands or definitions imposed upon them by others. When a person has internalized messages of unworthiness, invisibility, or malleability through years of family dynamics or social conditioning, the act of asserting oneself becomes not merely a communication strategy, but rather a profound reassertion of selfhood against the gravitational pull of self-negation. The mechanism functions by allowing the individual to externalize what has been internalized as shame or inadequacy, transforming passive acceptance into active resistance through the simple yet revolutionary act of saying no, of stating what is true for them, or of refusing to pretend agreement where disagreement exists. This defense operates beneath conscious awareness, often erupting at moments of particular stress or accumulation, when the psyche can no longer sustain the fiction of perfect compliance or acceptable invisibility. What persists as curious and worthy of observation is how frequently self-assertion emerges only in crisis moments rather than as a consistent practice, suggesting that we have normalized the suppression of our own needs to such a degree that their expression feels dangerous, disruptive, or somehow illegitimate until circumstances force the hand and make silence itself the greater threat to PS. Self-deception represents one of the most subtle and pervasive psychological defense mechanisms, operating not through the complete denial of reality, but rather through the selective reinterpretation of available evidence in ways that allow us to maintain a preferred version of ourselves and our circumstances. Consider the individual who consistently overstates their professional accomplishments during job interviews or social gatherings, genuinely believing in the elaborated versions of their past successes to the point where the distinction between what actually occurred and what they have narrated becomes increasingly blurred in their own mind. This person is not necessarily lying to others in a calculated way. Rather, they have engaged in a form of mental reorganization where inconvenient truths have been sidelined, exaggerated accomplishments have taken center stage, and their narrative has become their reality. The mechanism functions through a sophisticated filtering system wherein the mind selectively attends to information that supports the desired self-image, while simultaneously diminishing, reinterpreting, or entirely overlooking contradictory evidence that would threaten this carefully constructed internal narrative. What makes self-deception particularly effective as a defense mechanism is that it operates largely beneath conscious awareness, allowing the individual to experience complete subjective sincerity even as they maintain false beliefs about themselves, their relationships, or their circumstances. The person genuinely believes their own story because the psychological work of deception has already been completed before the narrative ever reaches their conscious mind. And this seamless integration of false beliefs into the fabric of their self-concept makes the defense virtually undetectable from within. Consider the moment when you become acutely aware of yourself in the middle of performing an everyday action, and in that awareness, something shifts in how you experience the moment itself. You might be walking down a familiar street, and suddenly you notice that you are walking, observing the mechanics of your own stride, the way your arms move, the rhythm of your breathing, and in this metacognitive turning inward, the automaticity of the action dissolves into conscious deliberation. This is self-observation at work, a psychological mechanism wherein the mind steps back from direct experience to examine itself as if it were an external object worthy of study and analysis. The mechanism functions as both a cognitive tool and a defensive shelter, creating a layer of separation between your experiencing self and the self that is being experienced, a kind of psychological distance that can protect you from the full emotional weight of what you are actually feeling or doing. When someone feels overwhelmed by their emotions, the mind can strategically shift into a mode of observing those emotions rather than being consumed by them, noting the pattern of thoughts like a scientist studying data rather than a person suffering through a crisis. This detachment allows for a certain kind of clarity, a reduction of immediate reactivity, because the part of you that observes is inherently calmer than the part of you that feels. Yet what makes this mechanism persist, what keeps us returning to this strategy of self-observation, even when we might benefit from fuller immersion in our experiences, is that we have learned to trust the observing mind more than we trust the experiencing one. We live in a culture that valorizes analysis and objectivity, that teaches us to step back and think about our thoughts, to evaluate our emotions as though they were fascinating but ultimately manageable phenomena. Imagine you have just completed a presentation at work that lasted 45 minutes, during which you delivered most of your material clearly, answered questions thoughtfully, and received polite nods from your audience. Yet there was one moment, perhaps 30 minutes in, when you stumbled slightly over a particular statistic and had to pause for a few seconds to locate the correct figure before continuing seamlessly with your talk. Now consider how, as you replay this event in your mind throughout the rest of your day, you find yourself focusing almost exclusively on that single moment of hesitation, turning it over and over in your thoughts, imagining how others must have perceived that brief stumble, while simultaneously filtering out or minimizing all the parts of the presentation that went well, all the questions that were answered effectively, and all the positive feedback you may have received from colleagues afterward. This psychological phenomenon is known as selective abstraction, a defense mechanism through which we extract particular details from a larger experience, usually negative or threatening details, and allow them to dominate our perception of the entire event, while simultaneously abstracting away or rendering invisible the broader context and the predominantly positive elements that actually composed most of the experience. The mechanism operates as though our minds possess a specialized filter designed to locate potential threats or failures within a sea of successes, extracting these needle-like points of concern and magnifying them until they become the entire landscape of our memory and emotional response. What makes this process particularly remarkable is that it occurs largely outside our conscious awareness and continues to persist even when we intellectually recognize that we are doing it, even when we remind ourselves that one moment of hesitation does not define a 45-minute presentation, even when. Consider a moment when someone experiences profound emotional pain, grief, or anxiety about their circumstances. Yet rather than processing these difficult feelings directly, they begin to focus intensely on sexual thoughts, fantasies, or behaviors, channeling their psychological distress into an expression that feels more manageable and controllable than the original source of their suffering. This redirection of emotional energy away from genuine psychological conflict towards sexual preoccupation or behavior represents the defense mechanism known as sexualization, a process wherein the mind converts painful or threatening emotions into sexual desire or activity as a means of gaining temporary relief and a sense of agency. The underlying logic operates through a kind of psychological substitution, where sexuality becomes a vehicle for expressing needs that feel too vulnerable or frightening to acknowledge directly, such as the need for connection, control, reassurance, or escape from unbearable internal states. When someone feels powerless, rejected, or deeply anxious about their worth, the pursuit of sexual validation or engagement can paradoxically feel like an assertion of power and desirability, transforming passive suffering into active choice. What makes this mechanism particularly persistent within modern consciousness is that sexuality itself carries such complexity in human experience that the distinction between genuine sexual desire and defensive sexualization becomes genuinely difficult to discern, allowing the mechanism to operate largely outside conscious awareness. We have normalized this process across countless cultural narratives and interpersonal patterns, rarely pausing to consider whether particular sexual preoccupations might represent authentic desire or might instead represent attempts to manage underlying psychological pain that deserves gentler attention and genuine processing rather than displacement into genital focus. Consider the experience of viewing a photograph of yourself from years ago, perhaps a decade or more, and feeling an almost complete disconnection from the person in that image, as though you are observing a stranger wearing your clothes and bearing your face, a phenomenon so common that we rarely pause to examine its peculiar nature or what it reveals about how our minds construct the continuity of identity across time. This is splitting images, a psychological defense mechanism in which we maintain two entirely separate mental representations of ourselves at different points in our existence, refusing to integrate them into a coherent narrative of personal development and change, thereby protecting ourselves from the uncomfortable awareness of our own transformation and the mortality that such change implies. When we stand before a mirror today, we experience ourselves as fundamentally continuous with who we are right now, a present self that feels eternal and unchanging. Yet when we encounter photographic evidence of our former appearance or former circumstances, we unconsciously choose to treat that person as fundamentally different, someone we were rather than someone we are. A subtle compartmentalization that allows us to deny the unsettling truth that we are not static objects, but rather fluid processes constantly being altered by time and experience. The psychological mechanism operates on the principle of temporal distancing, where we create psychological distance between our current identity and our past identities by emphasizing differences rather than continuities, focusing on how much we have changed rather than acknowledging the unbroken thread of consciousness that has persisted through those changes. And this compartmentalization serves the defensive function of allowing us to avoid confronting the anxiety that comes with recognizing ourselves as beings in constant flux, subject to forces beyond our control, aging inexorably toe. Consider the person who finds themselves unable to directly confront a painful memory or overwhelming emotion, so instead they transfer that feeling onto something smaller, more manageable, something concrete they can hold in their hands or point to in the world around them. A woman who has endured a difficult relationship might find herself obsessing over a single object from that time, a watch or a photograph or a piece of jewelry, pouring all of her unprocessed grief and anger into contemplating that one symbolic thing rather than facing the full weight of what actually happened to her. A man who cannot articulate his deepest fears about mortality might instead become preoccupied with the cleanliness of his home, the ordering of his belongings, transforming abstract existential dread into the concrete, manageable problem of dust and disorder. What is occurring beneath the surface is a remarkable psychological sleight of hand, where the mind takes something intangible and overwhelming and condenses it into a symbol, a stand-in, a representative that is far easier to examine, control, and potentially resolve. The mechanism works because symbols are finite and bounded, whereas emotions are vast and formless, and our minds naturally seek to create structure from chaos. We take the infinite and make it finite. We take the invisible and make it visible. We take the incomprehensible and give it a face or a form. What allows symbolization to persist so deeply in human consciousness is perhaps how seamlessly it operates beneath awareness, how readily we accept that our preoccupations are about their stated objects rather than about what lies beneath them, and how satisfying it feels to finally have something concrete to focus on, even when that focus is ultimately a distraction from what truly needs our attention. Consider the person who has struggled with debilitating anxiety for years, who has attended therapy and learned coping mechanisms, who has made genuine progress in understanding the roots of their distress, only to discover that as the anxiety begins to fade, a new and equally troubling physical symptom emerges in its place, perhaps chronic pain or persistent digestive issues that seem to have no medical explanation. And yet they find themselves consumed by this new complaint with the same intensity they once directed toward their anxiety. This phenomenon, which unfolds quietly in the spaces between healing and relapse, represents a fascinating and often frustrating aspect of how the human psyche manages unbearable internal experiences. Symptom substitution occurs when the mind, faced with the resolution of one psychological conflict or distressing symptom, essentially trades that symptom for another one that serves a similar psychological function, allowing the underlying anxiety or emotional disturbance to find a new avenue of expression rather than being truly resolved. The mechanism operates on a fundamental principle. The psyche generates symptoms not arbitrarily but as adaptive responses to internal conflict, and if the deeper conflict remains unaddressed, the need for symptom expression persists, merely redirecting itself toward a different bodily system or behavioral manifestation. What makes this process so psychologically compelling is that the new symptom often receives more social validation and medical attention than the original one, allowing the person to maintain a sense of legitimacy for their suffering while avoiding the more stigmatized realm of mental health. And thus the substitution paradoxically represents both a failure of true healing and a clever negotiation with the parts of ourselves that need to be heard. Imagine sitting across from a therapist or counselor, and as the session progresses, you begin to notice that your feelings toward this professional person are becoming increasingly colored by emotions that don't quite belong to them. Perhaps you feel an unusual warmth, an inexplicable resentment, or a desperate need for their approval that seems disproportionate to the actual relationship you share. You might find yourself seeking their reassurance in ways that feel almost childlike, or you might feel inexplicably angry at minor comments they make, reactions that seem to come from somewhere deeper than the present moment. This is transference, the psychological mechanism where we project feelings, expectations, and relational patterns from our past onto people in our present, particularly onto authority figures or those in helping professions. The roots of this mechanism lie in how our minds organize experience and relationship patterns. Throughout our lives, we develop templates for how relationships work based on our earliest and most formative connections, particularly with caregivers, parents, and other significant figures. These templates become deeply ingrained neural pathways that our brains automatically activate when we encounter similar relational dynamics or hierarchies. When we find ourselves in a situation with someone who occupies a position of authority, care, or emotional significance, our minds unconsciously overlay these old patterns onto the new person, and suddenly we're responding not to who they actually are, but to who they remind us of or represent. What makes transference persist despite our intellectual awareness is that it operates largely outside conscious control. We can know intellectually that our therapist is not our mother, that our boss is not our critical father, that our partner is not our abandoning sibling, yet our emotional systems continue to respond as though these old relationships are being reenacted. Consider the moment when a person finds themselves caught between two conflicting relationships, unable to resolve a direct disagreement with someone close to them, so instead they confide in a third party, seeking validation and alliance against the person they cannot confront. Perhaps a child caught between two parents describes one parent's behavior to the other, not to resolve the actual conflict, but to gain leverage, or an employee unable to address concerns directly with their manager instead brings a colleague into the conversation, creating a coalition that feels safer than direct confrontation. This is triangulation, a psychological defense mechanism where the mind strategically introduces a third party into a two-person dynamic in order to avoid the vulnerability and risk inherent in direct communication. The mechanism works by distributing the emotional weight of conflict across multiple relationships, which paradoxically makes the original problem feel more manageable even as it becomes more complicated. When we triangulate, we are essentially outsourcing our emotional regulation to another person, using their presence and agreement as a buffer against the anxiety that direct confrontation produces. The third party becomes a validator, an ally, sometimes even a messenger, and their involvement transforms what could be a simple disagreement into a more complex social negotiation. What makes triangulation persist despite its obvious ineffectiveness is that it does provide temporary relief from discomfort, and this short-term reduction in anxiety reinforces the behavior even though the underlying conflict never actually resolves. We have normalized this pattern across families, workplaces, and communities, often without recognizing it as avoidance, instead framing it as seeking advice or support. The mechanism remains attractive precisely because it feels productive while requiring no direct emotional risk. Consider the person who experiences anger toward another individual, perhaps someone who has hurt them deeply or treated them unfairly, yet finds themselves unable to express this anger outwardly and instead directs it inward, becoming their own harshest critic, their own enemy, transforming legitimate rage into self-condemnation and self-punishment that manifests as guilt, shame, or even self-harm. This psychological mechanism, known as turning against self, represents a redirection of hostile or aggressive impulses away from their original target and toward oneself. A reversal that allows the individual to maintain important relationships or social positions while simultaneously processing the threatening emotions that arise from conflict or disappointment. The mechanism emerges most powerfully in situations where expressing anger directly feels genuinely dangerous or unacceptable, whether because the target of that anger holds significant power over us, because we depend upon them for survival or security, because cultural or familial conditioning has taught us that our anger is inherently wrong or shameful, or because we fear abandonment more than we fear our own suffering. When a child is punished by a parent they love and need, the child's natural anger toward that parent becomes an intolerable cognitive conflict, and rather than sustain the terrifying prospect of hating someone essential to their survival, the child transforms that anger into self-blame, concluding that they themselves are bad, defective, or unworthy of love. This mechanism persists into adulthood with remarkable tenacity, so that a person might internalize criticism from partners, employers, or society itself, channeling outrage into self-directed contempt that feels almost morally justified, as though punishing oneself is somehow redemptive or protective. When we find ourselves repeatedly positioning ourselves as the injured party in our relationships and circumstances, we engage in a defense mechanism known as victimization, wherein we unconsciously frame ourselves as powerless recipients of others' harmful actions rather than acknowledging our own agency and choices within the situation. Consider the person who constantly recounts the ways they have been wronged, who interprets neutral comments as personal attacks, who remembers conversations selectively to emphasize their suffering, and who derives a strange comfort from this narrative of helplessness, because it absolves them of responsibility for the outcomes in their life. The psychological mechanism at work here is quite simple and deeply protective. By casting ourselves as victims, we escape the anxiety and shame that accompany personal accountability, and we gain the secondary benefit of eliciting sympathy, attention, and support from those around us who feel compelled to rescue or validate us. When we are the victim, we cannot simultaneously be the cause, and this fundamental shift in perspective offers tremendous psychological relief, even as it locks us into patterns that prevent genuine change or growth. The victimization defense persists not because it solves our problems, but because it provides immediate emotional comfort and social reinforcement, and we have collectively normalized this stance to such an extent that constant self-pity is often mistaken for authenticity rather than recognized as a defensive posture. We tell ourselves stories in which we are acted upon by fate, by others, by circumstances, and these narratives feel true because we have rehearsed them so thoroughly that we have lost sight of the moments when we did make choices, did have alternatives, did participate in creating the very situations we now lament. Imagine yourself facing a situation where the odds are clearly stacked against you, where logic and probability suggest a particular outcome is unlikely, yet you find yourself genuinely believing that things will somehow work out in your favor simply because you want them to so desperately. Perhaps you're applying for a position at a company where thousands of qualified candidates are competing, or you are hoping that a relationship will improve despite months of deterioration and incompatibility, or you are expecting a financial windfall from an uncertain source when your bills are mounting. In these moments, wishful thinking operates as a psychological defense mechanism that allows you to inhabit a mental space where desire becomes almost indistinguishable from probability. You construct narratives around your hopes, emphasizing the small possibilities while minimizing or entirely discounting the substantial evidence that contradicts your preferred outcome. This mechanism functions by essentially allowing your emotional needs to override your rational assessment of reality. When the psychological stakes are high enough, when the anxiety or disappointment of accepting the truth feels unbearable, the mind performs a kind of gentle distortion, not quite a delusion, but rather a selective filtering of information that permits you to maintain hope. The remarkable aspect of wishful thinking is how deeply normalized it has become in human experience, how we rarely question it or recognize it as a defense mechanism at all. We celebrate optimism and positive thinking, often without distinguishing between reasonable hope and the kind of thinking that denies reality. This mechanism persists because the short-term relief it provides is genuine and immediate, while the eventual confrontation with truth remains distant and uncertain in our minds. Consider the person who finds themselves caught in a difficult emotional situation, perhaps a conflict with a loved one, a professional setback, or a personal disappointment. And rather than avoiding the discomfort or denying its existence, they instead choose to sit with the feeling, examine it carefully, and gradually process it through conversation, reflection, or deliberate action. Working through represents one of the healthier psychological mechanisms available to us, wherein we acknowledge the reality of our distress and methodically engage with it, allowing ourselves to experience the uncomfortable emotions while simultaneously developing understanding and moving toward resolution. This person might spend an evening writing in a journal about their feelings, or they might schedule a difficult conversation they have been postponing, or they might simply allow themselves to feel sadness fully rather than immediately distracting themselves with activities or substances. The mechanism operates on a fundamentally different principle than repression or denial, because it does not reject the painful experience, but instead incorporates it into consciousness and processes it deliberately. Working through requires a certain psychological courage, an acceptance that growth and healing sometimes demand that we experience discomfort rather than evade it, and that understanding ourselves more completely means tolerating the temporary pain of self-examination. Yet despite its obvious benefits and the universal recognition that confronting our difficulties leads to genuine resolution, we continue to observe in ourselves and others a persistent reluctance to engage in this process, an almost automatic tendency to reach for easier coping strategies when the moment demands actual work. Imagine a person who has experienced a significant betrayal by a close friend, yet when asked about it, they describe the situation in purely clinical, detached language, speaking of facts and dates and logistics without any emotional coloration whatsoever, as though they were recounting events that happened to someone else entirely rather than wounds inflicted upon themselves. This is neutralization, a defense mechanism through which we strip away the emotional charge from painful or threatening memories, transforming them into neutral narratives that we can safely contemplate without triggering the full force of our feelings. The mechanism works by creating a kind of psychological distance between our conscious mind and the painful experience, allowing us to acknowledge that something difficult happened while simultaneously insulating ourselves from the sting of that acknowledgement. When we neutralize an experience, we are essentially translating emotional pain into intellectual observation, converting the vivid colors of felt experience into the grayscale tones of mere fact. This process involves a shift in our cognitive framework, where we emphasize the objective details of an event while systematically diminishing or omitting the subjective emotional dimensions that give the event its true weight and significance. What makes neutralization particularly interesting is how we have normalized this response in our contemporary culture, where emotional restraint is often framed as maturity or professionalism, and where the ability to discuss traumatic events in a composed manner is frequently mistaken for genuine healing. We see it constantly in workplace environments where people discuss tremendous stress without apparent emotion, in social settings where individuals recount painful relationships with remarkable composure, in therapy sessions where clients report harrowing experiences in tones that might otherwise be reserved for weather reports. Consider the experience of viewing a public figure or person in your life through the lens of absolute categories, where they exist entirely as either wholly good or wholly bad, with no possibility of occupying any middle ground or containing contradictions within themselves. You might idealize someone completely, attributing only positive qualities to them and dismissing or reinterpreting any evidence of their flaws or mistakes, until a single disappointment shatters this image entirely, causing you to reverse course and see them as entirely corrupt, entirely selfish, entirely wrong. This dramatic shift happens not because new information fundamentally changed who they are, but because your mind cannot comfortably hold the complexity that most human beings contain both admirable and troubling qualities simultaneously. Primitive splitting operates as a survival mechanism from early development, a way that young children naturally organize the world into safe and dangerous, good and bad, before their cognitive abilities mature enough to synthesize contradictions and nuance. The psychological mechanism behind this defense involves compartmentalizing information and experiences so thoroughly that conflicting thoughts about the same person or situation never need to meet in your conscious awareness, sparing you the discomfort of ambivalence and the anxiety that comes from uncertainty. Your mind trades accuracy for comfort, choosing clarity of categories over the messy reality of human complexity, and in doing so, it protects you from the destabilizing recognition that people you depend upon might harm you, or that people you distrust might contain something worthy. This pattern persists despite our rational understanding that people are inherently complex, contradictory beings, because the emotional relief of categorical thinking remains more immediately rewarding than the mature tolerance of ambiguity and contradiction, and because admitting Imagine a therapist sitting across from a client who reminds them in subtle ways of someone from their own past, perhaps a sibling or former partner, and without fully realizing it, the therapist begins to respond to this client not entirely as they are, but as a projection of that earlier relationship, their tone shifting slightly, their interpretations colored by unresolved feelings from their own history. Their professional distance narrowing in ways that feel genuine, but are actually rooted in their own unconscious needs and wounds. Countertransference occurs when the helper, the observer, the person in the role of understanding becomes emotionally entangled with the person they are meant to help, transferring their own experiences, desires, fears, and unfinished business onto the other person, then reacting to them based on this emotional overlay rather than seeing them clearly. This mechanism serves a protective function in the human psyche because it allows us to unconsciously recreate familiar patterns, to attempt resolution of old conflicts through new relationships, to maintain a sense of continuity and predictability even when that continuity is actually distorting our perception of reality. The therapist who feels irritated by a client's passivity might be responding to their own mother's learned helplessness rather than the client's actual presentation. Or the supervisor who seems unusually invested in a mentee's success might be trying to become the mentor they never had, and in both cases, the person being responded to becomes a character in someone else's internal drama. We normalize this process by accepting it as simply human nature, by acknowledging that helpers are human and therefore flawed, by treating these moments of misattunement as inevitable rather than as distortions that require active awareness and correction. And we persist in allowing our own history to guide our responses to others because the alternative D. Imagine you wake in the middle of the night with a sudden sense of dread, a feeling so overwhelming and so present that you become convinced something terrible is about to happen. And you lie there in the darkness searching your mind for what disaster might be unfolding, only to find no actual evidence or logical reason for the panic. Yet the emotion feels so real, so undeniably true in that moment, that you accept it as fact rather than as a temporary state of nervous activation. This is emotional reasoning, a psychological mechanism in which we treat our feelings as direct evidence of reality, allowing the intensity of an emotion to become proof of whatever narrative our mind constructs around it. When you feel anxious about a presentation at work 3 weeks away, the anxiety itself becomes proof that the presentation will go badly, even though you have delivered dozens of successful presentations in the past. When you feel lonely after a friend does not respond to a text message within an hour, that loneliness becomes proof that the friendship is dissolving, that you have done something wrong, that you are fundamentally unlovable, despite years of evidence suggesting otherwise. The mechanism works by collapsing the distinction between internal state and external reality, between the weather of your nervous system and the actual climate of your circumstances, treating your neurochemistry as a reliable instrument for measuring objective truth, rather than as a fluctuating reflection of your current psychological condition. We persist in this reasoning because emotions are immediate and visceral, while logic is abstract and requires effort, and because evolution equipped us to respond quickly to danger based on gut feelings rather than deliberate analysis. A survival mechanism that served us well when threats were physical, but that now misfires constantly in a world of ambiguity and uncertainty. Imagine a person who has spent years believing they are environmentally conscious, someone who recycles faithfully, lectures friends about plastic waste, and feels genuine pride in their ecological awareness. Yet this same person drives a gas-guzzling vehicle to work alone every single day, takes multiple flights annually for leisure, purchases excessive amounts of single-use items, and has never seriously considered the carbon footprint of their lifestyle choices. When confronted with this contradiction, they might experience a profound discomfort, a mental friction that feels almost physical, as though two incompatible beliefs are grinding against one another in their mind. This uncomfortable sensation is cognitive dissonance, the psychological state that arises when we hold two or more conflicting beliefs, values, or attitudes simultaneously, or when our actions directly contradict our stated principles. The mind naturally abhors this contradiction because it undermines our sense of internal consistency and coherence, which we desperately need to maintain a stable sense of self and identity. When this discord emerges, we become motivated to resolve it through various means. We might change our behavior to align with our beliefs, though this requires effort and sacrifice. We might rationalize the contradiction through creative mental gymnastics, convincing ourselves that our circumstances are special or that our hypocrisy is justified. Or we might gradually shift our beliefs to match our actions, subtly redefining what we actually value without ever fully acknowledging that we have done so. What makes cognitive dissonance particularly insidious is how effortlessly we can employ these resolution strategies without conscious awareness, how smoothly we can construct elaborate justifications for our inconsistencies and wear them like comfortable clothing. Consider the moment when you scroll through your social media feed late in the evening, observing the curated highlight reels of your peers, their vacations, their promotions, their seemingly perfect relationships and accomplishments, and notice a familiar tension rising in your chest, a subtle sense that perhaps your own life is somehow insufficient or falling short of what it should be by comparison. This is the psychological defense mechanism of social comparison operating at its most insidious level, a process by which we unconsciously evaluate our own worth, abilities, and circumstances by measuring them against the real or imagined accomplishments and situations of others around us. The mechanism functions as a form of self-assessment tool, providing what our minds perceive as objective data points against which we can benchmark our progress and status within the social hierarchy. When we engage in downward comparison, selecting those we perceive as less fortunate or accomplished, we experience a temporary boost in self-esteem and relative satisfaction, a fleeting sense of relief that we are doing better than at least someone else. Conversely, upward comparison toward those we see as more successful creates motivation, aspiration, or in its darker form, a corrosive sense of inadequacy that paradoxically keeps us engaged in the comparison cycle itself. The mechanism persists with remarkable stubbornness despite our intellectual awareness that the comparisons we make are often fundamentally distorted, comparing our complete internal reality against fragments of others' external presentation. Yet we continue to engage in this deeply flawed reasoning as though it provides legitimate evidence. We have normalized this tendency so thoroughly that it feels almost natural, even necessary, to our sense of self-evaluation, when in truth it represents a defensive avoidance of the more difficult internal work of defining our own values and measuring. Consider the moment when you receive feedback on a project you've spent considerable time developing, and someone points out a significant flaw in your work that you somehow managed to overlook entirely. Your immediate response, almost before conscious thought can intervene, is to locate an external explanation for this oversight, perhaps blaming unclear requirements, insufficient resources, or unrealistic timelines, while simultaneously taking full credit for the aspects that turned out well. This is self-serving bias in its most natural habitat, the tendency of the human mind to attribute positive outcomes to internal factors like your own skill and intelligence, while systematically attributing negative outcomes to external circumstances beyond your control. When your presentation receives praise, you recognize your preparation and communication ability as the driving force. Yet when that same presentation falls flat, you quietly remind yourself that the audience was distracted, the technology malfunctioned, or the timing was simply inopportune. The mechanism underlying this bias is fundamentally a protective one, designed to maintain a stable and positive self-image in the face of an unpredictable world where failure and criticism are inevitable aspects of existence. The human ego, it seems, has evolved with a built-in defense system that filters information through a self-protective lens, allowing us to absorb success as evidence of our inherent worth while treating failure as merely circumstantial. What makes this bias particularly persistent despite its logical inconsistency is that we rarely examine our own explanations with the same scrutiny we apply to others, creating an asymmetrical reality where we see ourselves as more capable and less responsible for mistakes than we actually are.